Parliament, through whom we govern together. And the sun is our country, healing our past, improving our lives, and energizing our potential. Together, our constitution, our people, our parliament, and our country are building our great South African nation. Parliament TV, channel 408 on DSTV.
Following the President's State of the Nation address on 6 February, the Minister of Finance, Mr. Enoch Godongwana, will present a budget allocation for 2025 to Parliament. The budget speech, among others, aims to balance economic growth and support for the vulnerable in our society despite limited resources. During the speech, Mr. Godongwana will outline all the financial, economic and social commitments that the government will prioritize in its planned expenditure. The Minister will provide a detailed plan for 2025 spending, including proposals for revenue collection to help fund government's planned interventions and commitments. He will also introduce the appropriation bill and table the division of revenue bill, which Parliament will process in the following months. The budget process is one of the critical instruments that Parliament utilizes to conduct oversight over the executive. Watch the budget speech live across Parliament's platforms. Your Parliament, your voice, your future.
Dumela ma Africa Borwa amatle. Welcome to our coverage of the Budget Speech 2025 right here on Parliament TV. We are coming to you live at the Parliament TV studio on the precinct in Cape Town. Libito la ka ke Tshepo Mori.
And a happy birthday to you, Miss Mori.
Thank you.
I am Tembin Kosi Ngoma, the much anticipated day for the Budget Speech 2025, the first for the 7th administration and the first under the Government of National Unity that was formed after the national and regional elections last year, has arrived after an unprecedented postponement on 19 February 2025, which was the initial date on which the budget was scheduled to be tabled before the National Assembly.
Of course, the postponement was due to the unforeseen disagreement, which included the proposed value-added tax hike. Now, Cabinet could not reach an agreement and had to go back to the drawing board. Now, the delay has caused uncertainty amongst members of Parliament regarding the consequences related to the legislative framework governing the budget process.
And now let's take a look at the proceedings of the 19th of February, when the Speaker of the National Assembly, Ms. Togodidiza, announced the postponement of the budget speech that was scheduled to take place. Stay tuned.
I have just had a consultation with all the whips of parties following a consultation with the leader of the government business. In terms of Rule 48, subsection 2, we have decided to adjourn proceedings for a date to be determined by the programming committee. This is in accordance with Rule 10. Honorable members, before we started the session, we were informed by the leader of government business, as it is the process in terms of the communications between ourselves and the executive, that while today we've been gathered here to actually have the Minister of Finance presenting the budget to this august House, that there has not been agreement in terms of parties in the executive to actually find one another in proposals of the budget. And the executive therefore decided, as some of you already know, and as your whips have said in our discussion, some things that have already been on the media about where there are possible increases and where different parties as well as members of the communities perspective on those proposed increase were same, and Cabinet therefore decided not to come and do a presentation of the budget and allow themselves enough time to re-look at the budget and come back to this House in March at the time at which they will inform us.
On the issue of postponement, we agree with the postponement, Honourable Speaker, to allow the executive to finalize those contentious issues that they are dealing with in the interest of all South Africans. We therefore requested that we need a date for the budget speech to be tabled. I thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Madam Speaker, contrary to what some of the opposition parties have said, what is happening here today is actually showing two factors that should create immense confidence in what is happening in this country. The first is that Parliament is not a laughing stock, but that Parliament is no longer a rubber stamp to bad policies that will cripple our economy. And the second message that should go out to the markets and to the people of South Africa, Madam Speaker, is that the GNU does not consist only of one political party. Madam Speaker, therefore, the DA supports this postponement.
We are saying, if we say we have democracy, let democracy come and exercise itself here. This is the theater of politics. Let the Minister of Finance come and say whatever I wanted to say. We don't want to hear rumors. We hear very disturbing rumors that the VAT would have been increased by 2%. In other words, we hear rumors that this ANC-led government wanted to impoverish our people.
Okay,
we have no sympathy with that. The minister must come here and say what he wanted to say, and then we'll deal with it here.
Thank you.
This is not a practice that we want to set for this Parliament. It is going to be your legacy, Speaker, that during your tenure, Parliament could not debate and adopt budget. We are saying to you, you are denying this body an opportunity to be receiving a budget, debate it, accept it or reject it. You are now subjecting the budget of South Africa to party politics when the budget is supposed to be above party politics. Let the budget be presented here and let Parliament decide that this is the decision that we are taking as Parliament.
Welcome back. You are still watching the build-up to the 2025 budget speech scheduled to commence at 2 p.m. in the National Assembly. And those were some of the views from members of the African National Congress, the Democratic Alliance, the Umkhonto weSizwe Party, and the Economic Freedom Fighters during the National Assembly proceedings on the 19th of February 2025. After the announcement of the postponement of the budget speech.
And that's why we find that today, Wednesday, the 12th of March 2025, we anticipate the Minister of Finance, Mr. Enoch Godongwana, to take to the podium before the National Assembly in the new Meester Dome at 2 p.m. to deliver the national budget speech.
Of course, that's right, Tsepo. It is important to note that the budget is more than just numbers and percentages. It's about funding key government priorities that the President outlined in his State of the Nation address in early February, shaping the future of our economy and ensuring that resources are located where they are needed most.
Now, the key priorities outlined by the President can be expected in the budget speech. They are the economic growth and job creation, infrastructure development, social welfare and service delivery, public sector reform, and of course, digital transformation.
And under economic growth and job creation, the President committed to drive inclusive economic growth with a target of exceeding 3% GDP growth, significant infrastructure investment exceeding 940 billion over the next 3 years planned to stimulate the economy and create jobs, and to focus on modernizing industrial policy, including localization, diversification, digitization and decarbonization.
Under infrastructure development, a substantial portion of the infrastructure investment will be allocated to state-owned enterprises for projects like roads, bridges, dams and ports. And under social welfare and service delivery, the President made commitments to the National Health Insurance Scheme and improvements to the healthcare system. He further made commitments to explore a basic income grant, improving government efficiency through digital transformation, including a national digital identity system, and improve service delivery to the citizens of South Africa.
And under public sector reform and digital transformation, the President announced that efforts to build a capable, ethical and development state, the development of a graduate recruitment scheme to attract talent to the public service, fighting corruption, the rollout of a digital ID system, improvements to the government.za web platform, and increased digitization of government services.
And these are the key priorities and goals set out by the President during the State of the Nation address in February. And we can expect the Minister of Finance, Mr. Enoch Godongwana, to table a budget speech that aligns with these priorities and the achievement of these goals today at 2 p.m. in the New Miester Dome that serves as the temporary National Assembly chamber.
And what role does Parliament play in this process? As the legislative arm of the state responsible for performing oversight, holding the executive to account, and facilitating public participation and involvement, Parliament's role in the process is of paramount importance. It doesn't just receive the budget, it scrutinizes it, debates it, and approves it. And this ensures financial accountability, responsible governance, monitoring of public funds, ensuring that departmental targets are met, and highlights the importance of the national budget for economic growth, potential investments, job creation, efficient and effective public service.
Now, as we said earlier, the budget speech will outline how Treasury will fund key government service delivery priorities as announced in the President's State of the Nation address. Now, the address sets the tone for today's budget speech, where the Minister of Finance will outline how those priorities will be funded. Now, the speech is not just a document. Today, the Minister will table the fiscal framework, the Division of Revenue Bill, the Appropriations Bill, as well as other related budget information.
And the budget process doesn't end there. After the speech, Parliament will take over to ensure that every cent allocated is aligned with the national priorities. This is where members of Parliament step in to scrutinize, debate, and ultimately approve the budget through a structured process. Parliament exercises its oversight role in several ways. First, it debates the fiscal framework, which is the plan for government spending and revenue collection. Then, it considers the Division of Revenue Bill, which determines how funds are shared across national, provincial, and local governments. And finally, it examines the Appropriation Bill, which allocates money to specific departments and government entities.
Most importantly, Parliament's oversight function continues throughout the financial year, not only in the two houses, but in its committees, where the executive is expected to report quarterly on their targets and financial statements. Now, parliamentary committees monitor government spending, assess service delivery performance, and ensure that departments remain accountable for their use of public funds.
And this is a critical part of our democracy, ensuring that the budget works for the people. A reminder that you are watching the build-up to the 2025 budget speech that is scheduled to be delivered by the Minister of Finance, Mr. Enoch Godongwana, in the National Assembly at 2 p.m. this afternoon. Stay tuned to Parliament TV as we discuss the glaring challenges of poverty and inequality in South Africa and highlight the importance of this budget speech with Professor Julian May, who is the Commissioner at the National Planning Commission. Please stay tuned.
Processing of the budget is one of the most important oversight functions of Parliament. The budget reflects the choices that government has to make, and it is the tool it uses to achieve its economic and development goals. In the budget, government sets out what it's going to spend and the income it collects, which it needs to finance its expenditure. The government has to balance a wide range of legitimate demands with limited resources at its disposal. Budget oversight is intended to help government move forward to realize its goals by increasing government's accountability to its citizens. The budget process occurs over a period of about 18 months. The budget of any financial year undergoes a 4-stage process. The stages are drafting, planning and formulation, the legislative process, implementation, as well as auditing and assessment. Parliament and government departments plan the budget for months in advance for the following year, implementing the current budget while continuously monitoring it for delivery and compliance with policy, and evaluating and auditing the previous year's budget. During the legislative phase of the budget, the National Assembly, the National Council of Provinces, and the provincial legislatures debate budget votes with the involvement of interest groups and civil society, the media, and the general public. This is to ensure that they reflect national priorities and accommodate outcomes and actions required by the mid-term strategic framework. It is important to measure the effectiveness of public spending and the manner in which public resources are spent. The more immediate goals are to ensure that government budget priorities are consistent with the declared policy objectives and that the financial resources allocated to priority areas are spent fully and properly. However, a larger purpose of the budget process is to contribute to democracy through ensuring openness, transparency, and accountability for public resources.
Igama lami ndiyisikhokheli ifana ngumbanye ndiyofuna apha eMusheshe 37 ndizoba ndizokwenza 13 kulo nyaka. Ingxaki esinje singabantwana abancinci sidibane nazo ukufisa i-challenge sesinzima kakhulu ngoba singabantwana siyahlukunyezwa kakhulu. That's why uBhuthulane uye wafika besikoleni njenge-fundraising wasikhe wasipha i-chance uba masiye phaa kuye ke sizikhule iintliziyo zethu into ezenzeka esitratweni. Saya kuye ke uBhuthulane asinceda saze safumaneka sakhululeka ngoku kwasemoyeni sisikolo salapha eMusheshe. Ndacinga urhulumente uba angadoneyitha imali kwi-foundation ezidila nabantwana kuba singabantwana ezinye izinto zisiphathe kakhulu. Ngamanye amaxesha khe sicinga uzibulala. Umyalezo endimgqithisayo ndithi mna masingalahlani ithemba. uThixo imini yakho iyazi uThixo sayigcinile. Awuyazi uba uThixo ngengomso ngengomso kwale miqobo osuleka ngayo uThixo uza kuphathele yakho into. So ndithi ke ngoku kwintanga zam ba masingalahlani ithemba kuse-early.
Welcome back to our live build-up to the 2025 budget speech here on Parliament TV, where we unpack the key themes, policies, recommendations and economic priorities that will shape South Africa's financial trajectory in the coming year. Now, as the nation eagerly awaits Minister Enoch Godongwana's address, it's crucial to explore the broader economic planning that informs the budget. Now, one of the key institutions guiding long-term national development is the National Planning Commission, which plays a strategic role in shaping South Africa's economic future. Now, today we are joined by Professor Julian May, one of the commissioners of the National Planning Commission, who is the director of the NRF-DSI Center of Excellence in Food Security at the University of Western Cape, and holds the UNESCO Chair in African Food Systems. Now, during his career, he has been involved in impact assessments and poverty diagnostics in 20 countries in Africa, Latin America, and the Indian Ocean Islands. He focuses on policy options that address the structural causes of poverty, including asset inequality, information asymmetries, and health shocks, and the demographic transitions. Now, his current research includes childhood malnutrition, climate change, and food system governance. Prof, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Of course, Prof, without a doubt, one can say that South Africa has serious socioeconomic issues such as poverty, unemployment, crime and health inequalities that need to be addressed quite urgently. Can you explain to us how dire the reality of poverty is, especially the poverty levels in South Africa?
Well, sadly, South Africa continues to have a very high level of poverty and persistent stunting among our children, which is a very severe concern. Stunting among children is a result of acute malnutrition, and it means that children are not getting enough to eat in the first 1,000 days. Roughly a quarter of our children are in that situation, and indeed the latest statistics say that that's actually going up, rising now to almost 28% of under 5 children. Roughly a quarter of our population are below the national poverty line. And you must remember the long-term goal of the National Development Plan is to eliminate poverty and to reduce inequality.
And of course, Prof, I mean, with the National Development Plan, that's only in 5 years. Just explain to us then, in your experience, what are some of the key drivers of poverty and inequality in South Africa?
I mean, it's sad to always revoke the past, to return to the past, but unfortunately, the structural damage, the spatial damage that was done by apartheid has a lot to do with the persistence of poverty in South Africa. Very large numbers of our population continue to live in areas which are underserviced. They have difficulty obtaining employment and have difficulty obtaining services. These conditions mean that they are often prone to economic and social shocks, which further drive them into poverty. The research done elsewhere in the world has said to be able to move structurally out of poverty requires 20 things going right. We haven't seen that in South Africa, and that has a lot to do with why we have this persistence of poverty and inequality.
And with that, you must be privy to the fact that the last time we were supposed to have the budget speech on the 19th of February, it was postponed. And one of the issues was the reported proposed 2% VAT hike. In that case, what would the implications of a VAT hike be on the poor and the most vulnerable?
Well, let me start with why we would need to raise additional revenue. Over the last couple of months, the Planning Commission has actually been seeking advice and consulting quite widely in terms of what are the requirements for not only this budget, but for successive budgets. As you've already mentioned, the National Planning Commission is concerned with the long term.
Yes.
So it's not only the next 5 years until 2030, but we're already starting to think about what follows, what happens next, where will we be in 2050? And I think those are the kinds of things that why we've been trying to seek advice and guidance from experts in the field. One part of that, one issue that really does seem to be important is that there is consensus that government revenue needs to increase. There are many reasons for this. We've noted previously that our key social grants, say for example the child support grant, no longer purchase the same basket of essential goods as they did when they introduced. Earlier you mentioned the sluggish economic growth that we've experienced. That's led to alarmingly high levels of unemployment, especially for new entrants in the labour market. And this is one of the reasons why we have the continuation of the social relief of distress grant. And then finally, we have significant infrastructure deficits. And that's compounded by the fact that we have not been maintaining our existing infrastructure. Taken together, this affects the provision of basic services, the cost of doing business in South Africa, our food security, and ultimately the ability to achieve any meaningful growth. So that is why I think the Minister has a difficult job now of thinking about how are we going to achieve that additional revenue. We can't really make do with what we've been spending before if we are to do some of the things that in fact the Planning Commission noted in its call to action last year, where we described the need to increase grants to a more meaningful level, as well as other kinds of interventions. Each of those cost money.
Now, yes, go ahead, Prof.
And again, I think as I think you've raised earlier, also in the show today, ultimately a budget needs to balance the expenditure that we have plus the expenditure that we need to do to service our debts must equal the budget, the tax revenue that we're able to rise and what we're able to borrow. And I think we're pretty clear now, the one thing we ought not to be doing is borrowing any further.
Now, with that, Prof, I mean, you're talking about a balance here, and that's something that the minister will have to, that's one of the challenges that the minister has, especially in the economic climate that we find ourselves in. Now, what are then the key recommendations that the Commission has made to government regarding measures that need to be taken to support the poor, eradicate inequality, and create employment, especially because now the MPC is looking at a long-term timeline and not necessarily just the 5 years that we are focused on?
Well, I think like many others, we have been calling for the improvement in the efficiency of government spending, the professionalization of government, and ultimately moving towards the position which the National Development Plan called for, which means that we have an effective developmental state. We're a long way from achieving that, and we have given government some recommendations about how to bring about that. I think we've also been calling for the fact that the National Development Plan isn't only the concern of national government, it's a concern of all spheres of government, and it's a concern of all parts of society, including Parliament. So as an example, also in our call to action, we stress the importance of Parliament holding government to account for the delivery, for making progress towards the National Development Plan. So those are things in terms of the institutional structures that the National Planning Commission has been engaged in. But we've also been working on the need for a social protection floor and what kinds of grants, what levels of grants, and how grants can be better organized to be able to achieve that, so that we use the considerable spending that we make on social grants more wisely. So that too is an aspect of the work that we've been doing. And then finally, another area which I might like to stress is the input that the Planning Commission has been making on the importance of infrastructure. This is partially also thinking about how we can ensure that we have the infrastructure to generate the energy at a cost that South Africans can afford, as well as the water that South Africans require. So all of those are areas where the Planning Commission has been making giving advice in terms of how we can move better. Ultimately, all of this comes to the need for a coordinated planning framework whereby government and different spheres of government start to link their plans, start to think about not only this budget, but about future budgets. Our medium-term development plan, which is a recent innovation, which starts to think again about how these interventions are not simply what happens this year, but how we go move forward in following years.
And then, Prof, of course, South Africa's triple threats are poverty, inequality, and unemployment. And all of them are interlinked. There is a golden thread through them because, I mean, without being employed, then it means that there is no equality, and it means that the chances of being impoverished are very high. What are some of the emerging trends or issues related to poverty and inequality that South Africans should be aware of?
There are a couple. I've already alluded to the importance of child poverty.
Yes.
And I think one of the things that we've been saying in the Planning Commission is if we were to put children at the center of our planning, if we were to plan for children in the future, we could definitely make a dent on poverty and inequality. And that's thinking about things like, how are our early childhood development centers functioning? What role are they playing? And in particular, what role are those early childhood development centers that are in formal settlements or in rural areas? What is their contribution? Are we adopting rules and regulations that make it difficult for them to function? And can those rules and regulations be looked at so that we can find ways of overcoming it? I think often what the Planning Commission has been stressing is that we have frequently adopted rules and regulations that might not be appropriate for a country which is shaped such as South Africa and which has South Africa's legacy. So I think that is a very important part of the trends of understanding poverty and inequality. There's also an issue which we've been debating around not only inequality, which is a theme of the National Development Plan, but also inequities. And the inequities refer to inequalities which are unjust, are unnecessary, and which are unfair. And we certainly have plenty of those in South Africa, sometimes not even things that we are aware of. An example there would be how our economy is structured, how our rules are structured, and how then people who are disabled interact with that, and are we treating them unfairly and in an unjust manner. So again, this has been a very important theme in this National Planning Commission.
And Prof, then how can then civil society and private sector and other stakeholders contribute to poverty reduction and inequality efforts in South Africa?
Well, let me start with the private sector. Since revenue has been such an important issue in this budget, as we've been saying, much more needs to be done and the money needs to come from somewhere. I think one of the things that we are aware is that there are resources available in South Africa for investment in infrastructure. Those resources are often held by the private sector, and key there is then finding ways in which the private sector has the confidence to be able to invest in joint infrastructural projects. Much of what's being talked about now is the notion of public-private partnerships. But to make a successful public-private partnership, those who have the funds, the private sector, must feel that their money is going to be safe, that their investment is going to yield a return, and that they are not being placed at risk by entering into such partnerships, or worse, being made to jump through hoops and hurdles, which simply increase the time and the expense of making that investment. So again, one of the things that we think is important is a facilitative environment within which such partnerships can occur and in which such investment can be made which benefits society rather than on perhaps investing in things that we don't necessarily need in South Africa. Yeah, I have in mind our tendency to invest in shopping malls, and only recently have we started moving to be able to invest in renewable energy, which clearly was an important need. So that's on the issue of the private sector and how we think about how a plan can reassure the private sector and bring them into our national development plan. Civil society also plays a very important role. We saw how civil society mobilized during COVID, both in terms of being able to safeguard communities and societies, so that's an important role, but also to be able to challenge government and hold government accountable, in addition to how we hold government accountable via the parliamentary system. And I think that is particularly important. In my own area of work, which you've already mentioned, in the area of food security and hunger, this was one area where probably for the first time we saw people protesting about the fact that they go hungry. And again, I think this is something where we need more attention by civil society. Again, thinking about my own area of work, in South Africa, we've tended to normalize hunger. It's normal for us to see hungry people. But in fact, in a country as well as South Africa, we ought not see hungry people. And it's again about moving away from this normalization of things which really are not acceptable.
And then with that, Prof, especially taking into consideration your career and how it spans over the years and throughout different parts of the world even, are there any international best practices or lessons then that South Africa can learn and can apply to poverty reduction and inequality efforts?
There certainly are many lessons that can be applied to the reduction of poverty and inequality. But let's think about what was going to take place today, which is what lessons can be learned to be able to have a better budget process. And here I think there are lessons that we can learn. You know, whatever happens this afternoon, a broader issue remains that South Africa's fiscal institutions and budget processes require reform. And this is particularly in the case of how the process takes place. What we need to recognize is, again, whatever is put forward this afternoon, we need to see it as part of a sequence of policy choices over time. They need to be accompanied by implementation actions, and they need to be guided by a comprehensive planning system so that we bring all these goals and actually achieve the reduction of poverty and inequality. I think we are seeing efforts to try and spatialize information, recognizing the spatial inequality of South Africa, and we are starting to see measures to try and make our interventions more appropriate to our context, where, for example, the informal economy is such an important part and needs to be grown and nurtured, but is often not. Now, something that was raised during our consultations was the notion of what's being tried elsewhere, and this is the idea of a fiscal charter. Perhaps this was not needed in the past, but when we have a government of national unity, we actually need a process where there is a framework that guides everything that we are doing, that is done as we enter into the budgetary process, and is signed and is a transparent process that citizens can see. So it will be signed, for example, by all of those that are participating in the government of national unity. We'd like to see that obviously aligned with the principles of the National Development Plan, and that focuses then on our development goals. But what we have learned from elsewhere in the world, that charters such as this can be effective mechanisms to promote responsible fiscal management, enhance policy credibility, and also bring about agreement between political parties that are participating in the kind of coalition governments that we have in South Africa at the moment.
And lastly, Prof, what are some of your expectations from the Minister's speech today?
I think we are going to have to see, we're going to have to recognize that the Minister is going to have to find ways of increasing the revenue that government has at its disposal. Perhaps it might not be the kind of increase of VAT that we saw in the previous attempt to present a budget, and we might need to move steadily towards how we are going to increase the levels of revenue to that which is desired, but we ought to be making steps towards that. I think there are things that the Minister can be thinking about, which would be about reprioritizing the budget and eliminating those parts of the budget that would not fit in. I really hope the Minister takes seriously, and again, this is something that the Planning Commission has discussed, the importance of reintroducing spending reviews so that we understand what our money is being spent on. And that is not only in terms of the departmental budgets, but also how we allocate our government spending between men and women, between adults and children, and between those that are poor and those that are not. So those are things I'd like to see in this budget.
Thank you so much for making the time, Prof.
Thank you again.
And that was Professor Julian May, a commissioner at the National Planning Commission, providing insight into South Africa's reality when it comes to poverty and inequality and the necessary measures that government needs to consider when it comes to reducing poverty and inequality. Now, as we focus on the political and global climate that South Africa finds itself in, we need to get a better understanding and insight on the relevant domestic and global matters. And we will get into that with Prof. Zwele Tujolobe, and he's an associate professor in the Department of Political Studies at the University of Cape Town. Stay tuned, you're watching Parliament TV.
Turning to the international outlook, global economic growth is forecast at 3.2% in 2024 and 2025. Global trade is expected to grow by an annual average of 3.3% and over the same period. There are several risks to this outlook. These include persistent geopolitical tensions, and the threat of escalating conflict in the Middle East remains a concern. Wars elsewhere, such as in the Sudan and the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, threaten regional and international stability as well as global trade. These risks imply that emerging markets and developing countries such as South Africa will continue to face headwinds over the medium term. Domestically, we focus on a real GDP growth of 1.1% in 2024. This is lower than the estimate of 1.3% in February. Over the medium term, growth is forecast to average 1.8%. This underscores the need for higher inclusive growth to meet the aspirations of a better life for all. This policy statement aligns our strategy to lift the economy to a higher and more inclusive growth path. The strategy is anchored in 4 pillars. The first one is maintaining macroeconomic stability. The second one is to implementing structural reforms. Thirdly is supporting growth-enhancing infrastructure, and lastly, building an ethical and developmental state. Honourable members, Pillar 1 is about a stably transparent and predictable macroeconomic framework that creates a conducive environment for businesses and households to save, spend, invest, and grow. The National Treasury has the responsibility for oversight and implementation of macroeconomic policy framework.
Following the President's State of the Nation address on 6 February, the Minister of Finance, Mr. Enoch Godongwana, will present a budget allocation for 2025 to Parliament. The budget speech, among others, aims to balance economic growth and support for the vulnerable in our society despite limited resources. During the speech, Mr. Godongwana will outline all the financial, economic and social commitments that the government will prioritize in its planned expenditure. The minister will provide a detailed plan for 2025 spending, including proposals for revenue collection to help fund government's planned interventions and commitments. He will also introduce the appropriation bill and table the division of revenue bill, which Parliament will process in the following months. The budget process is one of the critical instruments that Parliament utilizes to conduct oversight over the executive. Watch the budget speech live across Parliament's platforms. Your Parliament, your voice, your future.
Welcome back. As we await the delivery of the 2025 budget speech by the Finance Minister, Mr. Enoch Godongwana, at 2 p.m. at the temporary chamber of the National Assembly, the Nivemiesta Dome, we look at the domestic and international political climate. On 20 December 2024, President Cyril Ramaphosa assented the Expropriation Act 13 of 2024. And among other things, the Act intends to provide for the expropriation of property for a public purpose or in the public interest, and to regulate the procedure for the expropriation of property for a public purpose or in the public interest, including payment of compensation. Since then, President Trump signed an executive order which halts aid to South Africa, citing concerns over the land expropriation policy. To talk to us more about the possible implications of the executive order and related matters is Professor Zolethu Jolobe, an associate professor in the Department of Political Studies at the University of Cape Town. Good afternoon, Prof. Jolobe, and thank you very much for talking to us at Parliament TV.
Thank you for having me, and good afternoon to everybody.
Thanks, Prof. And just to kickstart this conversation, given the recent decisions by the United States President to halt the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which is known as PEPFAR, the funding to South Africa, what can we expect as a country with regards to our economic stability, political cohesion, and global standing?
I think with regard to all of them, what we need to expect is a renegotiation of how we relate to the US. And the reason being that the various tensions regarding to our foreign policy and how it affects the US are not new. If you remember, in the past, say, 3 US administrations, they did raise a number of things that weren't necessarily in direct relation to our relations with them, but with how we approach various international issues that affect their national interests. And what's happened in the past is that we've always been able to engage in some kind of dialogue with them, where we come to some mutual understanding that did not prevent any potential instability with regard to our economy, and with regard to various other issues. I think that now we're entering a very new terrain, mainly because of our approach, specifically with regard to the Middle East, but more broadly with regard to, say, issues in Iran, our role in BRICS, and also our sort of ever increasing closeness with countries like China, for instance, where many, or not many, but very important voices in the US at the moment are seeing that we are approaching a potential red line for them, where they're seeing those other foreign policy issues that we have an opinion on as untenable, which means that we need to prepare ourselves for a reset in our relationships with the US, in such a way that is mindful that there are very important differences, firstly, but that we will be able to come to such a mutual compromise, if you like, that will not tarnish our, firstly, global standing, and two, our vital economic core interests. at the kind of center of this whole debate, meaning why we're having it in the first place, is that South Africa for many, many years has not had complete sovereignty over its public health system. And so we depend on countries like the US, in some cases countries like the EU, for instance, to supplement and to deal with a lot of the social issues that we don't make provisions for in our budget. And I think that the thinking behind that is that we want the kind of partnerships with them that are long-term and that deal with some of our core interests. I think that what we've seen in the last couple of weeks, in fact, is that that approach is no longer sustainable, and that as a country, we need to have complete sovereignty over all the issues that affect our population. While we won't be able to have that in relation to our economy, for instance, because the nature of international economics is such that there is a greater degree of interdependency. I think that how it relates to our social issues, especially things like public health or things like social development, etc., is that we cannot have our social policies, whether they be health or all these things, as something that is conditional on what happens on other capitals in the world. And so I think that in a kind of weird way is that this whole issue around Trump has pretty much exposed a kind of core vulnerability in how our government for the last 30 years has approached issues of public health. And I think that what we need to do, in fact, I'm not sure that they will do, but what we do need to do is that we need to address that in such a way that our government has complete control over our national social and health policies, because those are the things that are the most important to us, and those are the things that are key to the social contract between ordinary people and the government.
Thank you, Prof. You've mentioned the dependency on the United States and other foreign donors, especially in relation to our public health system, and you've made some, and you've also indicated that that is no longer sustainable. So, Prof, what are some of the proposals that you can come up with that will enable us to have a complete control of our public health system?
I think the first thing is that we've got to be, we have to not try and overshoot some of our core responsibilities. And so in my opinion is that I would rejig the budget in such a way that on all the key issues that affect our population or that are important to us, if you like, such as health, education, social development, etc., are made provided for in the budget. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that we have to revisit some of our priorities. We've got to sort of think quite carefully about, you know, where we put our money, for instance, and whether we're putting our money in the right place. A good example, for instance, I'm not saying that this is what should be done, but if you think about matters of defense policy, and we think about, you know, whether we need to have military adventures in the Congo, be they peacekeeping or not, you know, are those the kind of things that are key to our national interest? How do we define our national interest? I think that if you were to ask citizens, they would argue that the most important issues that we face are inequality, poverty, and all the things that relate to that. And the question there is that, are we providing adequate budgetary attention to those things in such a way as to make meaningful differences in the lives of our people? When it comes to broader issues, you know, foreign relations, do we have to have relations with everybody, for instance? You know, should we be more careful, strategic in how we do these things, etc. So I think that it's about, I think that the core of what I'm trying to say is that we have to make the most of what we have in a way that speaks to what our core national interest is, which really is about how do we make a meaningful difference to some of our most important problems, such as inequality, the way that it's racialized, such as poverty, for instance, is all of these things, and that we should make sure that how we deal with these things are all made provision for in the budget. I think that is a kind of core thing, which requires much deeper negotiations, I think, not only between parties, but between the government and civil society, the government and the broader society, so that at least, in a kind of like basic level, there's a common understanding about where our tax rands go to, whether it's income tax, whether it's VAT, and all these things, and that these issues go to dealing with our most important pressing social problems, firstly, and two, in that the government has got, or call it South Africans, have got the exclusive jurisdiction of dealing with these things, so that when there are problems, there are local mechanisms of accountability, so that when we are going to cut money from one place to the other, it's not done as a result of what happens in other capitals, for example, but in relation to what happens here. I think that is a core thing.
Now, Prof, the World Bank recently released a report, Driving Inclusive Growth in South Africa, and in that report, they're warning of urgent need for public spending reforms, and they also state that the government spending has not contributed to economic growth and the reduction of poverty. So do you think that South Africa has the capacity to function, especially without this PEPFAR funding, considering the high number of people affected by HIV and AIDS, and how is this likely to impact on the budget speech that we're expecting the minister to deliver today?
I think that in the last 30 years, the South African government can be accused of having very good policies, very, very good ideas, but a basic inability to implement them, which relates to problems around the bureaucracy, and problems around how we manage public institutions in general, and thirdly, the way in which the government adequately responds to the demands put on by the population. I think those are the kind of key issues that we've had, which means that we don't have any shortage of good ideas, we don't have any shortage of people, we don't have any shortage of research, we just have serious chronic problems in the way in which our state institutions are set up and what they actually do. And what I mean by this, therefore, is that what one may find is that the budget may in fact be a good budget. It may be one, in fact, that is able to respond to the moment that we find ourselves in, right? Which is a GNU, so it's no longer an ANC government. It may well be able to respond to the current international moment, in the sense that we need to rein in, which means that we need to sort of take more responsibility to the things that in the past we've given to some of our partners, etc. And we can do all of those things. But for as long as we preside over government institutions that are not able to perform their very basic functions, and here we're not only looking at national government, right? I think that when we're looking at the budget, for example, we're looking at allocations. The next level, therefore, is that, well, then once that money has been allocated, what do government institutions, be it departments, be it all these things, what do they do with it? How do they spend that money? And I think that the chronic problems this government has had, successive ones, mind you, whether it was Mandela, it was Mbeki, it was Motlanthe, it was Zuma, Ramaphosa, etc., is that all of them have been plagued by the same problems. That is the basic inability to do what has been agreed to. And that talks to structural problems in the way in which our civil service has been organized. I think that we've seen glimpses of this when we look at things like, say, metros, or how towns are run. If one drives from, say, Cape Town to PE, for example, or from PE to East London, or East London to Durban, and you look at the general state of affairs of a lot of towns and small towns, etc., that gives you a very good idea into the window of how our bureaucracy works at a very basic level. Which means, therefore, that the questions that we should be asking ourselves is not our ability to diagnose problems. That we can do very well. And I think that if we can look at the last budget speeches given over the last 25, 30 years, all of them have been good speeches. People have disagreed, perhaps, with maybe certain priorities, with maybe certain emphasis, etc. But I think that for the most part, the majority of them have been well received, which means that South Africans are very good at diagnosing problems. What we failed to do chronically is to implement what has been agreed to, which means that we have failed to spend the money in the appropriate way that would make a meaningful difference to the lives of people. That's the problem that we have, and that's what we've got to deal with. And so, if I were to predict what will happen today, I don't think that we will see anything that will worry us. I think that the Treasury has been very good in terms of how it has identified what the central issues in the society are, or the central issues that need to be resolved in terms of where to spend our tax rands and all these things. I think that the problem lies in the layers just below the Treasury. And so the real kind of thing that we need to look for now is not so much what happens today, but in the next few months, how this money unrolls, how it is spent, how all the different departments propose to spend the money, and then how they actually do that. That's where the challenge is in this country.
Prof, just to move on, currently the citizens are nervous about the possible increase in the rate of VAT, which was reportedly the main reason also for the postponement of the budget speech last month. Now, who do you think is most likely to bear the burden should there be a VAT increase on today's budget speech? And what impact will that have on ordinary citizens? I'm asking this question, Prof, also noting that there has been some reports that speak to that VAT increase, dropping it from 2% to 0.75%. But who will bear the burden should there be any percentage of VAT increase?
Look, the people who bear, or people who've borne the most cost in the post-apartheid period has been the middle class and the poorer people. They're the ones who have been the most affected negatively by the state of the economy generally, whether it's by rising taxes, that's the first thing, or whether it's by things like VAT, right? And I think that if we look at the amount of pressure that have been put on the middle classes in general, right? And this we can see in various forums, whether it's the level of debt, for example, or combined with the access to credit, or whether it's the rising cost of living, right? So now an ordinary shop, whether one goes to Pick n Pay or Checkers or wherever one goes, 30 years ago, what would come out of a shopping basket for say 200 Rand is very different for what comes out today, for example. And I think that always is something that affects ordinary people. Wealthier people in this country can absorb it, but your middle classes and your poorer people can't absorb things like VAT increases, increased taxes, and all these things. And so they're the ones who will be most affected by it. I think that what's also made things worse is that salaries as a whole have not increased at the same rate as these things. And so therefore people might perhaps in one level have some kind of pay increase, but it doesn't correlate with other stuff, such as the fuel price and all these things. And so therefore, every year, your kind of middle classes and your poorer people are finding that they have less and less money in their pocket, generally speaking, and thus have to take out more debt to supplement for it. And so therefore, we in this kind of thing, scenario, if you like, where the consequence of all of the stuff is that the country has a very, very low saving culture, which is dangerous. I have yet to see any budget or any national policy that has problematized the ways in which the middle classes in particular have been affected by these things. And I've yet to see them try to come up with solutions that would decrease the burdens placed on the middle classes. And so even, if we were to go beyond that, for example, and look at things like, when people say we need to finance NHI through rising taxes, what people don't realize is that wealthier people can absorb these taxes, right? The people who are going to get hit by the most are the middle classes. And so therefore the pressure is being brought to bear at that level. These are your, professional classes, people who are, key towards the daily economic activities of the country, are the ones who get penalized the most when it comes to these things. Yeah.
And Prof, we have a number of organizations in the country that sometimes hold the government to account, and amongst those is the Black Sash, which have accused the Minister of Finance of dislike. I'm saying dislike with inverted commas because that came from them. They've accused the Minister of Finance of dislike of SRD grants, which he was using to hold the country in ransom to increase VAT. And they've instead of the minister holding the SRD grants recommended a wealth tax adjustment, something they just spoke to earlier on now. What do you make of these proposals, and what are some of the expectations that you would have from the minister when he delivers the budget speech today?
Look, issues such as grants and, wealth taxes and all these things don't solve the problem, right? So they might provide some kind of short-term cushion towards the ways in which macroeconomic pressures affect ordinary people, right? And I think that politicians like to use these things as some kind of indicator because it gives them some kind of tool to measure performance against when it comes to the next budget and the next budget and then the election, right? And so if you look at the way in which welfare regimes across the world operate in and of themselves, for example, is that they don't solve the problem. All they do is provide some kind of net where, if you were living, say, on the bread line, you now live one step away from the bread line, but you're still on the bread line, right? So you can have a grant, for example, but, you're still living in, a two-room house in township, and you're still living, sort of a hand-to-mouth with that grant. It doesn't solve the problem, right? So I find these kind of debates sort of circular, right? Because they don't really do anything. For the position of the minister, for them it's more of a political instrument that you use maybe in this context, but most importantly, they will use it as a way to measure their performance against when they have to review their role with either the president or their party on the one hand, or when they will have to write up the next budget speech as a performance indicator to say, I've achieved X amount of grants, or more people want grants, and that's seen as a good thing. The important thing here is employment, and the ability of people of working age to earn the kind of income in order to give them agency. And in order for them to make a living on their own, I think, and make the kind of choices as the law requires them to do, and all these things. And I think that if we are to measure or to say, well, then how then do these, or to what extent do these debates around the SRD grant or even the VAT increase, etc., to what extent do they measure up against the provision of employment, and not any employment, by the way, not like a kind of expanded public works employment where you sit in the corner of the road and you wave a flag, etc. We're looking at when you actually have real earning potential in such a way that you're able to raise your children, you're able to raise families, have a house, create wealth for your kids, your grandkids, etc., that will deal with the structural contradictions. My fear is that debate is absent. And that's what I fear in all of these things. And that's what I fear when I hear people like the Black Sash or the minister, etc., in that they're not really dealing with some of the more core structural economic contradictions in our country, in that too few people work. And if too few people work, it means that a massive chunk of our population, irrespective of whether or not you have grants or no grants, or whether you increase VAT or not increase VAT. But if too few people work, that means that people don't earn an income. That means that, you can have as many grants as you want, right? But you don't give people the kind of agency that they can live their lives in a way that is good, and that and that should be expected. And this is the kind of debate that we don't see. And that is where the danger is, in fact, in the sense that, grants, are good, fine. Grants can provide, a good safety net and all these things, but they don't solve the problem of poverty, they don't solve the problem of inequality, and they don't solve all the related issues or social issues that come with it.
Prof, with these issues, we can have this conversation the whole day. I'd like to thank you very much for taking time off your busy academic program to be with us at Parliament TV, and we hope that soon we'll have you physically here in the studio.
Yes, no problem. I look forward to that.
Thank you, Prof. That was Professor Zweletu Jolobe, an Associate Professor in the Department of Political Studies at the University of Cape Town, providing some insight on the domestic and international political climate that South Africa finds itself in and possible measures of navigation. So as we count down to the budget speech, stay with us as we unpack more about the budget process, the role of advisory bodies, some insight and in-depth analysis from the Director of the Parliamentary Budget Office, Dr. Dumisani Yanchis, who will be joining us in a moment. Please stay tuned.
Following the President's State of the Nation address on 6 February, the Minister of Finance, Mr. Enoch Godongwana, will present the budget allocation for 2025 to Parliament. The budget speech, among others, aims to balance economic growth and support for the vulnerable in our society despite limited resources. During the speech, Mr. Godongwana will outline all the financial, economic and social commitments that the government will prioritize in its planned expenditure. The Minister will provide a detailed plan for 2025 spending, including proposals for revenue collection to help fund government's planned interventions and commitments. He will also introduce the Appropriation Bill and table the Division of Revenue Bill, which Parliament will process in the following months. The budget process is one of the critical instruments that Parliament utilizes to conduct oversight over the executive. Watch the budget speech live across Parliament's platforms. Your Parliament, your voice, your future. Processing of the budget is one of the most important oversight functions of Parliament. The budget reflects the choices that government has to make, and it is the tool it uses to achieve its economic and development goals. In the budget, government sets out what it's going to spend and the income it collects, which it needs to finance its expenditure. The government has to balance a wide range of legitimate demands with limited resources at its disposal. Budget oversight is intended to help government move forward to realize its goals by increasing government's accountability to its citizens. The budget process occurs over a period of about 18 months. The budget of any financial year undergoes a 4-stage process. The stages are drafting, planning and formulation, the legislative process, implementation, as well as auditing and assessment. Parliament and government departments plan the budget for months in advance for the following year, implementing the current budget while continuously monitoring it for delivery and compliance with policy, and evaluating and auditing the previous year's budget. During the legislative phase of the budget, the National Assembly, the National Council of Provinces, and the provincial legislatures debate budget votes with the involvement of interest groups and civil society, the media, and the general public. This is to ensure that they reflect national priorities and accommodate outcomes and actions required by the mid-term strategic framework. It is important to measure the effectiveness of public spending and the manner in which public resources are spent. The more immediate goals are to ensure that government budget priorities are consistent with the declared policy objectives and that the financial resources allocated to priority areas are spent fully and properly. However, a larger purpose of the budget process is to contribute to democracy through ensuring openness, transparency, and accountability for public resources.
Welcome back to our live build-up to the 2025 budget speech here on Parliament TV, where we unpack the key themes, policies and economic priorities that will shape South Africa's financial trajectory for this coming year. Now, obviously, the nation is eagerly waiting for Minister Godongwana to address the nation, and it is crucial that we analyze and engage with the processes of Parliament around the budget and conversation with our committee chairpersons and key budget advisory bodies to both government departments and Parliament.
And to provide the analysis and engagement that we need, we are joined by the Director of the Parliamentary Budget Office, Dr. Dumisani Yanjes, who has over 19 years of experience and is a recognized leader in African fiscal oversight arena across the African continent and beyond. Good afternoon, Dr. Yanjes, and thank you very much for being with us here at Parliament TV today.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And Doug, I mean, your office is always engaged with the committees, especially the committees on finance and appropriations. And recently, you've been tasked with preparing a brief to advise both the finance and appropriations committees about the implications of a possible VAT increase. Now, what are some of these implications that your office has identified?
Thank you for that. I think, look, what we did look at it was largely to try and provide Parliament with overarching analysis regarding the first budget of the term, to say, you know, what would be the key priorities set out in the mid-term development plan through SONA, and how those priorities will be realized. You know, we've got 3% growth target, we've got to deal with unemployment, deal with cost of living, deal with inequality, and also build the keep of the state, some of the priorities. So our view is to say, where would that throw government into getting more revenue? And obviously we know the minister did say from last month, public media briefing, that they wanted to introduce a 2% increase in VAT, which is in effect 13.3%. Let's be clear, it's not a 2%, because it's 30% increase.
How is that, Doc?
Remember, now the VAT rate is 15%.
Yes.
Now increasing it by 17, it's by 2 percentage points divided by 15, which is 13%. So it really increased 13% of VAT. But then that was where the debate came from. That's why the Finance Committee says to look at this first, but also provide potential alternative areas where additional revenue could be identified. So that's what's really the crux of the paper, where we say, okay, we need to look at it in two ways. You know, there's a revenue side of things, but more importantly also is the expenditure side of things, where when you generate this revenue, what you're going to use it for, you know, particularly when we want to drive growth, drive employment, and so on. So that's how, you know, broadly how we looked at it. What are the revenue potentials, and what are the expenditure areas that we want to spend that money? And we simulated it, or we modeled that to say, what does it mean for growth? What does it mean for employment? What does it mean for inequality? There's some of the key macro and social development indicators.
Which then takes us to the next question, Prof, because I wanted to speak on some of the revenue alternatives that your office has identified, especially in the brief that you produced for Parliament, and what are the potential implications for economic growth and fiscal stability for each one of those revenue alternatives?
Yes, thanks for that. I think what we did, we focused largely on the proposed 2% percentage point, and say, are there other areas that we could consider to get the same amount of money that was raised from there. And we did, in our simulation, we do show that if you increase from 15 to 17, would get you around 49 billion or so in the current year. But that could rise to almost 100 billion on condition that the money gets recycled back to the economy, because obviously it's a consumption tax. But then we looked at the debate about tax. It's always going to be in two-pronged, you know. Tax is a social instrument as well, as much as a revenue-raising instrument. And we thought about that aspect and say, when we look at it from the social objective perspective, it might counter us if we want to address social objectives like we look about inequalities and some of the social indicators that we want to address. Then we said, let's decompose that to say who really pays VAT. And we looked at it in that way to say, in our simulation shows that actually 30% of the VAT comes from the 2 quintiles of population, that the poorest pay 30% of that, and 50% of that is your of the VAT comes from the 2 top quintile, the rich. That's when we started decomposing from the social perspective to say that when you impose VAT, it means 30% still come from for the poor, and the other part will come from the rich. Then that's why we started to look at alternative measures to say, I don't think that world government would want to embed in more the poor as well. And we looked at wealth tax. This was the next alternative measure to say, as part of our simulation, where else can you get that 48 billion of that we getting 2%. And we said, okay, in our simulation, it does show that when you impose 0.5% on the top 2 quintile rich wealth assets, you can still get the same amount of money, which would have gotten in this VAT. But also the second part to that is that you dealt with social aspect, which meant that you were dealing with inequality at the same time. And we also looked at other mechanisms, but those are some of the where we dwelt a lot by simulating those two instruments. And we said once you raise this 48 billion, then it means you have to recycle back to the economy by increasing social spending, increasing investment, increasing support for social wage or education, health, so many aspects. And that is likely to give you growth that you want, and creates more employment, and creates dealing with inequalities, but also dealing with some of the more social aspects of, so it's a very good mix back.
I had a chat just before this interview with Professor Jolo from UCT, who was also shared the same views that you are sharing, that with the increase of VAT, you're likely to see the people in the 2 quintiles, which is your poor and the middle class, suffering more than if you had to increase the wealth, like the wealth tax. So how does your office assess the visibility and the effectiveness of these different revenue options, especially with the tax increases?
I think for me, the paper also, what it does, it recognizes that Parliament is a very important space for our country, where the decision discussions happens here. We're proposing these views so that during public participation, during the time where public comes here, Parliament can facilitate the conversation whether to say which of these mechanisms we want as South Africans and which of these will be better off, and so on. And I think that's the first part to say, as in public interest context, you want Parliament to have all these options so that when people come to debate, these options are in place. But the issue of wealth tax, we need to decompose it quite a bit, which I'm not going to do now. I know we don't have a lot of time. But it's an issue of really saying, the debate to say we already have some elements of that in our tax system. When you think about, dividends tax, other tax. But I think in this instance, you're referring to looking at the assets of the 2 quintile, the rich. And obviously it means you have to design it because we've never had it. And what we say in the brief, we recognize the difficulties, complexity around that. And then the United Nations published a report a year ago, which advises on wealth tax, but recognize the complexity to how to deal with that. Hence, in our brief, we said maybe it's something that we want to work with it over a year or so, where we introduce it more permanently in a year's time, whereas you have immediate need for revenue. So in a way, there are possibilities there, but it means you have to do some work to get it more permanently introduced in the system.
Of course, Doug, I always say that the issue of tax is such a sensitive issue. Everybody holds on to their seats when you talk about tax, because we're thinking it's more money out of our pockets some way or the other, whether it's direct or indirect. I just want to know whether your office has you explored any non-tax alternative measures then to ensure that there is an increase in revenue.
I'll take you back to my initial statement to say how we look at it in a way of this is the start of the term. We are coming with a low base as a country. We want to grow the economy, create employment. And to that extent, we always said there would have been a good argument for a need for additional revenue in that sense. So that what our commission said, there could have been a need for an additional revenue from that perspective, where that's the first part. You probably need to have a permanent revenue mechanisms, but there are, when you listen to other colleagues, other areas which are also looking at that, there probably are areas where you could have looked for pocket of money immediately, but it even doesn't solve the permanent need for revenue. But again, the issue is to grow the economy. When you grow the economy, your tax instruments mean they can fetch more, collect more money than when it doesn't grow. Do you know what I mean? Even if, no matter how much taxes you can impose, if the economy is not growing, you're not going to get that revenue that you want. And the last point, I know there's been debate around the tax authority. You know, its ability to collect more does need support, and that's a big patch of that as well. So yeah, there are a variety of non-tax mechanisms that you could still use on a immediate sense, but probably on a long term, you need to discuss the more permanent mechanisms to raise more revenue. And I say growth, it's the first one. Secondly, it's if you look at which taxes you want to, particularly that are less burdensome to the low-income households.
And Prof, Doc, I'm sure that brief makes some key recommendations, especially when it comes to tax compliance and the improvement of public financial management. Can you take us through some of those recommendations that you're making on the brief?
Regarding the compliance with look, I think the main issue would obviously be, you know, when budget is proposed, what would the process of considering it within Parliament, and that's probably when it triggers your regulatory framework in that regard, you know. But I think we focus a lot on ensuring that, you know, when the tax is introduced or whatever mechanisms, there has to be a clear sense where Parliament can oversee that process or can monitor that process. Otherwise, you know, that becomes a point of not generating more revenue than you require. Because in the year 2018, we've had a VAT increase then, and there was a forecast of revenue to be created then. And we now went back to say, did we really raise that revenue? And that, for me, the monetary mechanisms we try to talk about is very key for Parliament, at least, in that regard.
The conversation continues, but for now, let's look at the importance of oversight.
In terms of the Constitution, government is accountable to Parliament. Parliament, as the representative of the people, monitors and seeks to influence government policy and action through the budget. The budget is the instrument for translating policies and plans into public goods and services. Any policy or plan without a budget attached to it is unlikely to be successfully implemented. Economic success depends on the ability of government to employ limited resources with maximum effect. The role of Parliament in this regard cannot be overstated. Parliament's duty is to detect and prevent abuse, prevent illegal and unconstitutional budgetary conduct on the part of the government, make government budgetary operations more transparent, and hold the government answerable on how taxpayers' money is spent. Parliament exercises its oversight through various portfolio committees that assess the budget and other plans, as well as the performance of each department, including their financial performance, and hold them accountable. The budget process is crucial to good governance because it ensures that government expenditure remains aligned to South Africa's policy goals and objectives. What is also of great importance is that ongoing monitoring and tracking of the executive by Parliament allows for intervention in the event of wrongful expenditure and failures in service delivery. The process holds government departments accountable for their expenditure and gives Parliament and the citizens it represents an opportunity to make their own demands and interventions. President's State of the Nation address on 6 February, the Minister of Finance, Mr. Enoch Godongwana, will present the budget allocation for 2025 to Parliament. The budget speech, among others, aims to balance economic growth and support for the vulnerable in our society despite limited resources. During the speech, Mr. Godongwana will outline all the financial, economic and social commitments that the government will prioritize in its planned expenditure. The minister will provide a detailed plan for 2025 spending, including proposals for revenue collection to help fund government's planned interventions and commitments. He will also introduce the appropriation bill and table the division of revenue bill, which Parliament will process in the following months. The budget process is one of the critical instruments that Parliament utilizes to conduct oversight over the executive. Watch the budget speech live across Parliament's platforms. Your Parliament, your voice, your future.
You will have to speak to issues which are in the National Development Plan 2030, critical issues of unemployment. How is government going to deal with the issue of youth unemployment? Because we have got so many young people who are not working. On top of that, the economy can't even be able to absorb the young graduates. So this is a problem. And government has to do something about it, working together with the private sector. And then we also have to look as to how has SARS, which is dealing with revenue collection, managed to collect revenue to an extent that we still have challenges, because now we have got deficit. Deficit in the sense that the money that SARS has collected is not enough to can be able to cater for all the government needs. At the end, government has to go out and borrow. And for now, that is a problem, because government is spending more than 350 to 400 billion a year servicing debt, not to pay off the debt, because the debt is so high up to so far. So those are some of the critical issues that the minister will have to explain to the committee. How are they managing debt? Because it's a problem. How are they dealing with the issue of unemployment? How are they dealing with the issue of the economic growth? Because the solution is to grow the economy. So those are some of the critical issues that we'll be looking at and check as to whether the issues that is raising, are they funded in the budget.
You're still watching Parliament TV as we build up to the delivery of the 2025 budget speech by the Finance Minister, Mr. Enoch Godongwana, at 2 p.m. at the temporary chamber of the National Assembly, the New Minister Dome. And that was Dr. Maswanganyi answering a question with regards to the committee's contribution to reviewing, amending and initiating legislation related to the national budget. Now, we're still in conversation with Dr. Jantjies from the Parliamentary Budget Office. Doc, of course, we watched the chairperson as he responded to the committee's role in the contribution towards legislation, especially budget-related national legislation. With that now, he speaks to the medium-term development plan. And the last time that we spoke, we were speaking about how one of the concerns that the PBO had at the last engagements with the committees was how the medium term was not adopted. And now that it has been adopted, explain to us what the importance of the 5-year medium term development plan is and how it shapes the budget.
No, thank you so much. You're correct that it's important to have, that's how we look at the budget, to say we need to have a clear development strategy in place. And it seems, as the chairperson was saying, the National Development Plan is still the mainstay of the whole process. I think the assumption that we've made is that because we haven't gotten touch of the actual MTDP, is that the State of Nation address we've seen in earlier by the President last month it's overarching. It's really based on the mid-term development strategy. And our view has always been Parliament's analysis of the budget or adoption of budget should really use the MTDP as a lens to say, is this budget really talking to these issues? And that it's important in a way that otherwise, if we don't do that, in our view, there isn't going to be a good alignment. And we've argued with evidence over the years that there has always been divergence between the policy, strategic planning on one side, and the budget framework on the other side. So we need to work towards a better convergence. And hence I said earlier on, it's important that Parliament see this budget, what you say in the paper, as a crucial budget. As the first budget term, it has to be aligned to the mid-term development targets. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to realize those, and it becomes similar to the NDP, where we've not realized a lot of, we've done much progress, but 5 years down the line, before the finishing line, we're still far behind in many of the targets of the NDP. And that is important, that Parliament's processing of the budget, it focuses a lot on it, and I agree with Dr. Masongane in that interview as well.
And of course, then he speaks about unemployment, specifically youth unemployment. What are some of the key drivers of youth unemployment that your office has identified, and how can they be corrected?
That's a thesis question, the dissertation question. Look, I think one of the, we often take a step back, because the bigger issue we have is our economy. Our economy is not absorbing more people in the economy. And the debate we've had over time is really around the structure of the economy. When you look at a lot of times, that's first, the structure of the economy definitely has changed, where we need to focus a lot on the more productive side of the economy. Have more secondary sector growing more than the service sector, which we see in our case, where we see a lot of service sector, which is not a bad thing, but I think you're not going to get more people absorbed if you don't have a lot of investment in manufacturing, a lot of investment in agriculture sector, food processing, those where you can absorb people in big chunks of things. The second part, which we've also argued, and I sense that we'll see government, national treasury agreeing to that, the lack of investment in the government. Because remember now, in our national development plan, we've set ourselves 10% target of 10% of GDP being reinvested in the economy by the public sector, which is government and state-owned entities. But over the past 10 years, we've barely reached 5% of it. And that, for me, a simple example, if you look at sector, let's say construction industry, it's likely to absorb less skilled people more. I'm very simplistic, but it's more complicated than that. But if government doesn't build more roads, doesn't invest more, whatever, then you'll have more of those young, energetic youth not getting absorbed by the sector, for example, like agriculture, another one's in our agriculture. If you're not getting better investments to ensure we modernize our agriculture sector, you're not going to be able to absorb less skilled employees, because the bulk of our unemployed, when you look at the way they are, the statistics, we have a lot of unskilled unemployed, and a lot of it's really, in our view, lack of the structure of the economy supports more technical or the service sector, which is good, it's not a bad thing, but it should be the other way around, where you have manufacturing being bigger and supporting services. Now we have a different,
the other way around.
The second part is lack of investment by even businesses or private sector as well. We have set ourselves 30% all in all of GDP must be invested. We've barely reached 20%. So that, for me, it's a big challenge. Unless we address those through the budget, through other mechanisms, we'll still be here next year.
And it's a conversation that we were having, that now things are different. That before, probably even before that I was born, that people that had the skills, hand skills, were regarded the people that were almost important. When you say that you're going to a technical school, it was a thing. And now things have changed. Everybody wants to go to the traditional universities. Everybody wants to study to be an accountant, a lawyer. And maybe then Parliament can look at policies and trying to change that mind frame in people. Is that something maybe that we can look into as a country?
It's a good point, because when you look at a lot of support from the FET colleges, I don't know if they still call it, I think there's always been
colleges
yes,
now, yes.
I'm used to FET all the time. Sorry, I'm saying my age here. So a lot of investment has been tried to get more artisans in, as you say, in the space. But at the same time, as I say, the structure has to be able to absorb that of the economy. And I think there's strong evidence that structure is also a problem, because you're trying to, move away from more of productive sectors.
Yes.
So that's also important. And I agree with you, Parliament has a bigger role to play.
Yes.
And we have to do it.
On Monday, 10th of March 2025, the chairpersons of the Finance Cluster held a pre-budget media briefing about Parliament's rigorous oversight and accountability role in ensuring that the national budget serves the needs of all the people of South Africa. Now, when asked about the country's economic status and the decisions that must be made, this is what Mr. Musi Maimane, the chairperson of the Standing Committee on Finance, had to say, on appropriations rather, had to say.
I don't want to sound alarmist, and perhaps I want to give credence to the finance ministers that have served this country in the manner that they have, with the conditions they've had, and almost in some ways, when I think about Minister Godongwana, recognize the fact that we are now heading to a point of significant crisis. That is a reality. We are no longer making choices that are good or bad. We are making choices that are worse or much worse. And that's where we are. We are at the peak of taxation. You can't tax citizens more, and I'm talking about personal income tax in this regard. Because after that point, you start to create tax morality issues, where citizens simply figure out ways to avoid tax. Wealthy people don't pay as much tax because, to Honorable Zibi's point, you figure out a way to externalize your wealth. So the 460,000 taxpayers who sit in the middle, those who do the majority of tax payments, are the ones that are going to feel the ultimate impact. So now we must think about what choice we're making to honor those citizens. That is and these are not straightforward choices. You are now at a point where I don't think it's sustainable for South Africa to think of the budget as an exercise in adjusting for inflation. It must now think of the budget as an exercise of going, what significant choices are we going to make? There's a lot of discussion about saving millions to achieve a reduction in billions. For example, it's easy for me to sit here and say, sure, reduce the cabinet, right? Except the reduction of the cabinet, even consistent with the previous special appropriation, is only in the hundreds of millions relative to the 57 billion rand shortfall that you would either get or not get by increasing VAT. So we really are at a point now where we have to make tough decisions. And so when the question is put from the floor, do I endorse a VAT hike or more borrowing? In my personal capacity, I certainly can't. Because there are also disproportionate impacts when you start to increase VAT. In fact, over the long period of time, impacts the poor. And as I've alluded earlier, once your bonds are rated in the manner that they are, increasing borrowing in that regard is not going to help.
You are still watching Parliament TV as we build up to the 2025 budget speech to be delivered by Minister Godongwana at 2 p.m. this afternoon. And that was Mr. Musi Maimane, the chairperson of the Standing Committee on Appropriations, talking about the difficult decisions that need to be made by the South African government and some of the consequences of the alternative measures that could possibly be implemented to increase South Africa's revenue capacity. I'm still joined by the Director of the Parliamentary Budget Office, Dr. Dumisani Yanke. It's a grim picture there painted by Mr. Maimane, but in your view, should we consider ourselves heading for a significant crisis considering the fiscal and financial climate that South Africa currently finds itself in?
Look, when we look at the brief that we did in the previous budget, in February, pre-brief.
The postponed one.
Yeah, postponed one. Okay. We did look at that debate around whether we're in a fiscal crisis or financial crisis, I don't know. But I think it largely was about debt. The debate has always been we're highly indebted and so on. So I think what we try to do is just to decompose it, to say the evidence doesn't really support that debate a lot when you look at the context where we are as a society. Meaning that the debt to GDP ratio, for example, what we have certain debt to GDP ratio which is quite high. But when you look at the debt, we look at the composition of it to say how much of it we own it, how much of it is owned by foreigners, you know. But also going down further deeper down to say, do we have experience of defaulting on this over time? But also the profile of the debt itself. We have a very long-term profile, 50-year and maturity profile of that. So there are elements that says, generally when you look at other countries in a similar, almost similar status as, many of them have quite a higher percentage of GDP, but also 90% of our debt, we own it, meaning it's in local currency. So we are somehow protected from any shocks that can come from the foreign currency. So look at Argentina, for example. It's a country where there has been a very interesting example where you talk about from a country in a fiscal crisis because they had so much defaults that they had. Since 1930, we've never had any default in South Africa because government has always protected, there's always been a haircut when it comes to debt. So in that way, we are arguing that let's have a very sober conversation around that. Yes, the debt is high to GDP ratio, but it's as high as lack of growth. If you grow the economy, that expands quite a lot of times. But like I say, when you decompose the debt that we have, it gives some level of assurance to say, as much as it's high, but we need to focus on growing the economy. Because you can spend your time and try to deal with debt, or you can spend your time growing the economy, which will be more long-term permanent a solution towards the issue of the crisis. You know, I don't want to sound that I'm debating but with the chairperson, but I'm just saying it's always good to go deeper into these discussions, particularly where we're sitting at the stage as a country in a first term. You know, we need to be really preoccupied with how we're going to grow the economy, create more employment, and budget is a very important tool to get us to that. And I feel, in our brief, Parliament has a powerful role to play in trying to drive us toward that area. And revenue is one area, and yes, in some instances we'll have debt being part of the package on getting us towards that space of growth and increased employment.
And one of the issues that Mr. Maimane speaks about is, and raises it as a concern, is the issue of the bloated cabinet. And we know even previously that has been raised, even before the 7th Parliament, there has been outcry about us having such a huge cabinet. Now, when the president took over the 7th Parliament and became the president in the government of national unity, we saw an increase in cabinet again. Now, what are the financial consequences of this rather? And are you of the view that decreasing cabinet could make a huge impact on the financial situation of South Africa?
We haven't done, I'll be frank, we have not done analysis specifically around that. But I think the way, what I will say to you is how we've looked at the debate around wage bill, because it's been debate that we've contributed towards it. And I think our approach is say, Parliament has to demand the productivity of that, to say, we're spending this much on the wage bill. how productive that is. And in a way, you are forcing government to ensure it's productive in how much it spends on wage bill. And I feel that debate is more, more positive to have, and I think Parliament can drive that to say, I spend 32% of the budget in wage bill. How much are we getting as value from that? Then show us proof efficiency and so many other things. So there's quite a good debate and good argument around efficiencies, which I agree with Mr. Manov in that context. But we have not done a very deep analysis about the cabinet as a whole. It's a very difficult one. But from a wage bill perspective, which it touches on the cabinet as well, we think there has to be a debate about efficiency. Are we efficient? Are we productive with the amount that we spend in cabinet? And there's been a lot of discussion around this. One of the solutions to our budget problem is ensure efficiencies. But my concern around the debate around efficiency is that it shouldn't be seen as a solution. Efficiency will get you at most not more than 5 billion. Or I'm just being very overly optimistic here. We need way more than that. And some of the governance or deficiencies is part of the system, be part of bureaucracy. But we need to, it can be, what I'm saying is we can't see there's a solution out of where we are. Yes, it can get us somewhere, but we need more than that. And we need to make sure the public service is able to deliver service. Because on one side, we have a serious shortage of service delivery. So when you try to target the public wage bill, you need to really deal with that dichotomy to say there's a huge concerns about poor service delivery. And on one side, you're spending money. If you cut it, what does it mean for service delivery? So that's what I'm saying. For me, it's better that debate in a way where you want value for money as Parliament.
Dr. Yanjis, please allow me to thank you so much for always taking time out of your busy program to ensure that you are here with us at Parliament TV. It's really much appreciated.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, and thank you, viewers, as well. Thanks so much.
Yes, that's still watching the live broadcast of Parliament TV as we build up to the 2025 budget speech to be tabled by the Minister of Finance, Mr. Godongwana, at 2 p.m. this afternoon. And as mentioned earlier, the budget was initially scheduled to take place on 19 February 2025. However, it was postponed due to disagreements in the cabinet, and the delays have prompted debates with Parliament and the broader society as to whether government has considered other revenue sources other than VAT, given its regressive nature of the consumption tax. After this, we speak to Mr. Matthew Parks, the Parliamentary Coordinator for COSATU, to get some insight on the expectations of the labour sector. Stay with us.
Following the President's State of the Nation address on 6 February, the Minister of Finance, Mr. Godongwana, will present the budget allocation for 2025 to Parliament. The budget speech, among others, aims to balance economic growth and support for the vulnerable in our society, despite limited resources. During the speech, Mr. Godongwana will outline all the financial, economic and social commitments that the government will prioritize in its planned expenditure. The Minister will provide a detailed plan for 2025 spending, including proposals for revenue collection to help fund government's planned interventions and commitments. He will also introduce the appropriation bill and table the division of revenue bill, which Parliament will process in the following months. The budget process is one of the critical instruments that Parliament utilizes to conduct oversight over the executive. Watch the budget speech live across Parliament's platforms. Your Parliament, your voice, your future.
Welcome back to our special live coverage of the 2025 budget speech here on Parliament TV. As we build up to the Minister of Finance, Godongwana's much anticipated budget speech, we take a closer look at the role of the labor unions and their expectations from the Minister's speech later on at 2 p.m. today. Known as the largest labor union federation in South Africa, with a strong national and regional structure, the Congress of South African Trade Unions was established on December the 1st in 1985 in Durban after 4 years of negotiations between trade unions that opposed apartheid. COSATU includes many of the country's biggest unions, such as the National Union of Mine Workers And right now, we are joined by Mr. Matthew Parks, the Parliamentary Coordinator of COSATU. Good morning, Mr. Parks, and thank you very much for joining us at Parliament TV.
Good morning. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, sir. Just to kickstart this conversation, what are some of COSATU's expectations from the budget speech, and what are the key areas that you think the Minister of Finance should focus on?
I think a couple of things. One, we hope the government avoids the temptation to go to extreme options. We hope to move away from austerity budget cuts, which have really crippled the capacity of the state to provide the public services that workers, society, the economy depend upon. We hope to also avoid a temptation to increase VAT or income taxes upon the poor, working class families who are already struggling to survive with the rising cost of living, who are drowning in debt. We think there's a need to kind of get the basics right. We need to capacitate the state, make sure we can provide the services that society and the economy depend upon to thrive. We need to stimulate the economy to make sure it moves from a 1% GDP growth rate to at least 3%. We need to also provide a pathway for people to find jobs. So we need to address those fundamental issues, because otherwise we can tinker with it on the side. We're not going to address the fundamental cause of this crisis. It's not a it's not an expenditure crisis, it's an economic growth crisis, which then impacts upon revenue. I think for us, there were so many good things in the initial budget that was meant to be tabled. It spoke to ramping up investments in infrastructure, which is going to help grow the economy. It spoke to giving support to public employment programs, to rebuilding our SOEs. It spoke to providing protection for the poor, the unemployed, through social grants, through other, extending the VAT basket of goods, which are exempt from VAT. So I think for us it's also about how do you capacitate the state. And again, the budget had many of those things about filling critical frontline vacancies like doctors and nurses, teachers, police officers and so forth, rebuilding the frontline services. So we hope we retain those, but we look for an alternative to a VAT hike, because we feel a VAT hike, it treats the poor the same as you treat the rich. Workers are already struggling to cope with inflation, and you squeeze them a bit more, it's very difficult for them to survive. So we hope that government can rather focus on empowering SARS to improve tax compliance. We have about 800 billion rand of taxes which are owed to the state. We don't think you need to go after new taxes, rather go and fetch that money which is already owed. So if we hope that government will take this in a calm manner. There's only a revenue shortfall of about 58 billion rand, and we have tabled as COSATU proposals where we think the money could be found in a way which doesn't hurt workers.
You mentioned a lot capacitation of the state, and we know that there has been outcries regarding the service that is provided by the public servants who happen to be, some of them who happen to be your members, which is members of COSATU. What do you think needs to be done in terms of capacitating the state? Does this mean that, is it capacitating the state as in like the executive, the people that are in charge, or does it also include even capacitation of the workers?
So first about capacity in the frontline services. So you can't, workers are frustrated when they go to Home Affairs. They may have to queue for 6 days. And the reason why is because there's a 60% vacancy rate. So those long queues as a consequence. Where there should have been 10 staff, you've got 4 staff. So obviously the queues are going to be double. You also have an infrastructure capacity issue because the IT system is archaic, it's old, so it's constantly offline. So again, the queues are increased all the time. So if you fill the critical frontline vacancies, if you address the infrastructure issues, then you can improve the quality of services. So the government has shown with the South African Revenue Service that this is the path to rebuild the state. You appoint competent management, you remove corrupt criminal elements, you deal with the issue of corruption, you fill critical vacancies, you hire skilled staff, you invest in institutions' infrastructure capacity, and as a consequence, SARS has improved tax compliance from 61 to 64%. So to apply the same model to Home Affairs, to the police, to education, to schools, to universities, to health, then you will see the benefits. And if we simply take it as well, this is a financial burden to the state, sure, there's a price tag you pay, but society reaps the rewards. And when society gets the benefits of efficient Home Affairs or an efficient hospital or schools, etc., the businesses also benefit too from the product, and that means they're able to grow, that means jobs will be created, and that means that the revenue that the state needs to fund it will come to it. So I think for us we must take a longer term approach and not just simply take it as an accounting approach.
Now, a burning issue currently in the country, we've seen marches or pickets conducted by unemployed graduates, in particular those who have obtained their medicine qualifications, and we've read reports of how inadequate the services are in our hospital, and yet we are sitting with a huge number of people that have graduated on a rare scale, because I would consider a doctor to be one of those skills. What do you think needs to be done, because this is not painting a good picture for the country as well as for the civil servants.
Yeah. So look, in the budget that was meant to have been tabled, and we hope that element will be retained, there was an allocation for additional funding for hospitals to do the infrastructure, the deterioration of the conditions there. There was also funding for 1,800 doctors to be appointed to address that issue, to appoint more nurses. So we hope they will retain those things, because workers need those services. You know, there's a disruption to life when people have to queue for 12 hours to get basic medication, and then people often then forego the treatment because they need to go to work. And then it means they get sick, it means the workplaces gets disrupted, and so on. So we need to get the basics right. But also we have to admit our healthcare is broken. Public healthcare caters for about 86% of society. It's funded by roughly the same amount that goes to private medical care, which caters for about 14% of society. So the National Health Insurance said, let's see how we can pool the resources together, public and private, towards funding healthcare for everybody, make sure everybody is covered, make sure that everybody can access healthcare when they need it, and it's quality and so forth. So for us, that's the fundamental solution, because right now public healthcare is overwhelmed, private healthcare is too expensive, it's underutilized, and the consequence is that people are not getting treatment for diseases that are preventable or curable or manageable. They can't go to work, they lose out on wages, they pass away prematurely, the families lose a breadwinner, and of course the economy is disrupted as well. And the fiscus too bleeds because they have to take care of healthcare for something that could have been easily managed through primary healthcare. So I think for us we have to get the basics right and also look at the long-term path as well.
And now we know that on the 19th of February, when we were supposed to have the budget speech, it was postponed, and one of the main issues that has come out was the issue of increase in VAT. And having listened to the news going around, was that also the accusations, if I can put it that way, that have been made by some organizations that the minister doesn't seem to like the SRD grants because of some of the utterances from the minister relating to the SRC grant versus the increase in VAT. What do you think needs to be done, or what do you think what can be done for us to have another to get the money that we are looking for as the country? What is it that needs to be done?
Yeah, look, they kind of help ease the burden on the state by sharing the load. These DFIs do that all the time. We can just increase it a bit. Similarly, on the public employment programs, they could also have a similar approach to them, include the CETAs, the NSF, because at times government is paying for services that these very same institutions are required by law to provide. So, for example, COGTAD is not providing training for the community works program workers because it doesn't have money. But the CETA, and they're paying for the CETAs, but the CETAs are tasked by law to provide training. So we think we need to be a bit smart how to pool resources, how to reprioritize. We can do so. I think there is space to have a discussion with the Reserve Bank too, because under the foreign exchange currency reserves, which is about 350 billion rand, SARB is providing 25 billion rand this year, 25 billion rand next year. We think that you could ask the Reserve Bank to maybe top it up by another 10, 15 billion rand. So we think there's a variety of options you could do, which is not reckless, which is sustainable, but avoids imposing a VAT hike on workers who are just drowning in debt, who really just can't accept or survive with a further tax increase.
We've raised a number of suggestions that need to be done, but
item on the agenda. That will be the introduction of the appropriation bill, introduction of public sector pensions and related payments bill, introduction of ESCOM debt.
Introduction appropriation bill and tabling of division of revenue bill, introduction public sector pension and related payment bill, introduction ESCOM debt relief amendment bill, introduction revenue laws amendment bill.
Thank you, Honorable the Minister of Finance.
Order, Speaker. On a point of order, Speaker.
Order, Honorable Member. I will ask the Minister to take a seat first. There are two members. Honorable Mauta, there's the first member who raised his hand is Honorable Manye. I'll recognize you after him. Thank you. Honorable Manye, what's the point of order?
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, for us as the MK Party, we are asking purely based on the values of Ubuntu that on the 19th of February we're here to listen to the budget speech, which didn't happen. We think that the minister will be within the values and the realm of Ubuntu for him to apologize to this House for making us come here for nothing, and must also apologize to the people of South Africa which we represent here, that that day did not happen. So we're asking that that apology must happen. And also, Speaker, we also want to ask the Minister to take this House into his confidence to say what exactly caused him not to table the budget speech on the 19th. Thank you, Speaker.
Thank you, Honorable Mauda. Minister, you can take your seat. Minister, you can take your seat. I'll recognize the EFF. Yes,
Thank
Honorable
you,
Member.
Speaker. Speaker, I was looking at the time when you sat on that chair. It was exactly 3 minutes past 2. The House sitting is scheduled to start at 2. So, Speaker, you were late. All of us were here. The honorable thing for you to have done was to apologize for coming late and explain why you actually came late. So please, we request you to apologize for coming late and tell the country why you arrived late in this sitting that you have called yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, honorable members. We have noted both your requests as well as your comments. I want to remind honorable members that during the sitting on the 19th, which never proceeded to be the sitting, we gave an opportunities for parties to express themselves. Members of the executive were here, the leader of government business were here, and I'm sure the minister in presenting the budget have noted the concerns that have been raised then and have noted the concerns as they have been raised now. And I will leave it to the minister to then deal with the matter. Secondly, Honorable Maude, indeed, we start at 2. Oh, yes, sir? Okay, can you allow me to assist the minister? Let's not do what we usually not do in this House. We have decorum, we respect one another, and we allow the speaker to do what she has to do. Indeed, we're supposed to start at 3. We started, okay. On Wednesdays, we usually start at 3, but today, because of the presentation of the budget, we started 2. We do apologize because there were a bit of, people here on the aisle, which the Sergeant at Arms was trying to remove. I was here before 2 p.m. But we do apologize that we did not start exactly on the time as you requested. And all of us know that last time we had a not so kind dress rehearsal for a budget which will now be presented, but we are now asking the Minister of Finance.
Honorable Speaker, I'll probably assure Khila that I'm going to come back to that issue later. It's taken. Honorable Speaker, Literate, Chairperson of the National Council of Provinces, Refulum Ntsoeni Tsipane, Deputy Chairperson of the National Council of Provinces, Les Govender, His Excellency, the President of the Republic of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, Honorable Deputy President Paul Mashatile, Cabinet colleagues, members of the Executive Council for Finance, honorable members, Governor of the South African Reserve Bank, Commissioner of the South African Revenue Service, fellow South Africans. Just before, I'm going to come back to that point, Khila. I have the honor to table the following documents before this House. The 2025 Division of Revenue Bill, the 2025 Appropriation Bill, the 2025 ESCOM Debt Relief Amendment Bill, the 2025 Public Sector Pension and Related Payments Bill, the 2025 Revenue Laws Amendment Bill, the 2025 Estimate of National Expenditure, the 2025 Budget Review, and this 2025 Budget Speech. Just on a lighter note, Madam Speaker, let me first, before going on that lighter note, take the point raised by Honorable Manyi. And indeed, it was an inconvenience for this Parliament and the people of South Africa. And indeed, we owe this Parliament an apology. And we owe the people of South Africa an apology. No doubt about that. We didn't like the postponement. But on a lighter note, I saw on social media something that said this budget is postponed until my favorite club wins. That is Kaizer Chiefs. In cabinet, when I made this point, Dr. Ramkhopa wrote me a piece of note and said, "Oh, this budget will never be tabled." And Honorable Gigawa said, "Hey, these people are putting the country in crisis because this budget will never be tabled." Now, let me go back to the postponement, as I've apologized. Go back to the postponement and say the postponement of the tabling of the budget 3 weeks ago was a regrettable but perhaps an understandable feature of multi-party governance. It is also a sign of some of the difficulties associated with a multi-party democracy. But what is positive is that the delay has stimulated an unprecedented level of public debate about the difficult policy trade-offs we as a nation face. A vital debate about which policies to fund and how to fund them, about which priorities to pursue now and which ones we may need to delay in the context of unlimited resources. As much as the debate has been dominated by the proposed increase to value-added tax, the bigger debate must be about how we grow the economy for the benefit of all South Africans. A bigger, faster-growing economy and the larger fiscal resources that comes with it would give us more fiscal room to meet more of our developmental goals. But the truth is that our economy has stagnated for over a decade. In that time, GDP growth has averaged less than 2% far below the level required to meet our expanding list of needs. In 2024, the economy grew by only 0.6%. Over the medium term, GDP growth is projected to average 1.8%. To meet our goals of redistribution, redress, and structural transformation, the economy needs to grow much faster and in an inclusive manner. This is the central objective of the current administration. Today's budget proposes a bold and pragmatic approach to achieve this formidable task. It calls for macroeconomic stability supported by sound fiscal policy, for the deepening of structural reforms to remove the obstacles to growth and job creation, and for scaling up infrastructure to unlock the productive capacity of the economy while building a capable state that supports all these efforts. The budget remains committed to a balanced fiscal strategy. As projected in the 2024 medium-term budget policy statement, a budget primary surplus of 0.5% of GDP will be achieved in the 2025, and this will grow to 0.9% in 25-26. Government debt will stabilize at 76.2% of GDP in 25-26, while the consolidated budget deficit also narrows to 3.5% by 27-28. Madam Speaker, as debt stabilizes, a growing surplus will enable the government to reduce debt service cost as a proportion of revenue. Some of these savings will be used to build up fiscal buffers that we need as protection against future economic shocks. Shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic and other uncertainties stemming from the rising geopolitical tensions and the global economic ramifications thereof. Debt service costs will amount to 389.6 billion in the current financial year. This translates to 22 cents of every rand we raise in revenue. It is more than what we spend on health, the police, or basic education. We must reverse this trend and prevent the cost of debt from taking away resources that could otherwise be spent on our pressing social needs or to invest in growth. In this regard, our fiscal strategy stabilizes debt service cost as a percentage of revenue in 24-25 by maintaining a primary budget surplus. The ESCOM debt relief arrangements are also effective and contribute to improved fiscal position. ESCOM is now in a much better fiscal position than in 2023 when the debt relief was originally announced. As a result of these improvements, we have decided to simplify the final phase of the debt relief package. The last 70 billion debt takeover will now be replaced with a 40 billion in 2025-26, 10 billion in 28-29. This will result in a saving for the government of about 20 billion rand. Honorable members, these fiscal improvements are important milestones on our path to fostering a stable macroeconomic environment. That is a prerequisite for a higher level of growth. Strategy to achieve faster growth remains anchored in the following 4 pillars: maintaining macroeconomic stability, implementing structural reforms, improving state capacity, and accelerating infrastructure investment. Maintaining macroeconomic stability inclusive of prudent fiscal policy promotes stable prices, lowers interest rates, and enhances the country's resilience to external shocks. This creates a conducive environment for investment. Implementing structural reforms removes impediments to growth and creates a solid foundation for a higher and sustained economic growth. Madam Speaker, it was out of this realization that economic growth and fiscal stability are mutually reinforcing that Operation Vulindlela was formed as a joint venture between Treasury and the Presidents to fast-track the implementation of the structural reforms. Its objective were to stabilize the supply of electricity, create a competitive and efficient freight logistics system, reduce the cost of and improve the quality of digital communication, ensure a stable quality supply of water, reform the visa regime to facilitate skilled immigration and support tourism. Since its establishment in 2020, Operation Vulindlela has made real progress in achieving these objectives. For example, the energy reform that created 22,005 more than 10,000 megawatts are formally registered with NASA, which is of the last step in the regulatory process. These projects will contribute to was approved. The roadmap allows private sector participation and gives third-party access. Gigabyte data bundle has declined by 51%, allowing individuals and small businesses to access more affordable data. The water use license backlog has been cleared, unlocking billions in investment and freeing projects that had stalled because of the backlog. The water quality regulatory system was reinstated for the first time since 2014. This is the green drop, blue drop, and no drop certification that enables effective intervention in supporting failing municipalities to provide clean water to citizens. E-visas for travelers from 34 countries have been introduced to significantly boost tourism. The Trusted Employer Scheme has been established to fast-track visa process for major investors. These achievements have eased economic bottlenecks and built on the successes. So phase 2 of OV will focus on the following: through existing reforms in energy, water, logistics, and visa system. Strengthen local government in improving the delivery of basic services. Harnessing digital public infrastructure as a driver of growth and inclusion. And creating sufficient productive and inclusive cities. Madam Speaker, infrastructure is a key pillar of our growth strategy. It is the bedrock for economic development, a key source of jobs, and an avenue for scaling up service delivery. This budget reflects that understanding. Allocation towards capital payments are the fastest growing area of spending by economic classification. Public infrastructure spending over the next 3 years will amount to more than 1 trillion rand. The spending will focus on 3 sectors: 402 billion rand for transport and logistics, 219 billion for energy infrastructure, 156 billion rand for water and sanitation. In transport, the South African National Roads Agency will spend 100 billion rand over the medium term to keep the national road network in good condition. Provincial roads departments will reseal over 16,000 lane kilometers of roads in their areas of authority. Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa is making steady progress to rebuild the infrastructure to provide affordable commuter rail services. To sustain this progress, we have provisionally allocated an additional 19.2 billion over the medium term for critical signaling. This will enable commuters from areas such as Mamelodi, Wamashu, Motherwell, Khayelitsha, Naledi, to name but a few, to catch a train every 10 minutes. To get to and from work, and significantly reduce the money that lower-income households spend on transport. Let me pause and show an example. Let me pause. The World Bank has produced a report. People tend to be selective when they read the right report. They don't read what they don't like. What that report says is that rand for rand, if you had to compare a worker from South Korea and a worker from South Africa, rand for rand, the South African worker gets lesser disposable income than the South Korea. The explanation is cost of transport. In South Africa, that cost of transport is affected by two things: the spatial dimension, and secondly, the cost of transport. And these communities in our areas. I don't know, when somebody said it's not, this budget is not proper, what do you mean? This allocation will also allow PRASA to maximum the potential of the 241 new trains delivered through the rolling stock renewal program. Despite the progress made, PRASA procurement system needs strengthening. The management of the unit of the entity has already instituted measures to strengthen their procurement weaknesses. This includes getting support from the National Treasury to build capacity and mitigate risks, and undertaking live audits for larger procurement projects. In the water sector, we're investing in several large-scale dam projects that are ramping up or entering construction. The Mkomazi project is expected to commence construction in November 2027, transferring water into the Mngeni water supply system. This will increase the total capacity of the system to 5 million households in eThekwini and 4 district municipalities in KwaZulu-Natal. The Back Bill augmentation scheme is expected to start in July 2026. The project will improve the Western Cape's water supply system, improving regional water security while reliably supplying domestic, agricultural and industrial water users. To further accelerate infrastructure delivery and effectiveness, we are continuing reforms to facilitate greater private sector participation, capital budget reform and alternative infrastructure financing. The new regulations for public-private partnerships have been finalized and will take effect on the 1st of June 2025. The regulation reduces procedural complexity of undertaking PPPs, create capacity to support and manage PPPs, create clear rules for managing unsolicited bids, and strengthen fiscal risk governance. The regulation also makes provision for national department to establish sector-specific PPP units. These units will drive private sector participation, creating opportunities to optimize the balance sheets of financial distressed state-owned companies. The Department of Transport and Transnet will engage the market on PSP projects in the following areas: the iron ore, chrome, coal and manganese lines, expansion and automation of the ferrochrome and magnetite terminal at the port of Richards Bay, the container and automotive sectors, including the potential designation of the South African container port system as a regional transshipment hub for major shipping lines, and establishment of independent rolling stock leasing company. Should Transnet require gap funding for its PSP project, the budget facility for infrastructure will consider these after proper packaging and financial structuring. Additional guarantees may also be considered to finance the entity's maturing debt as well as its capital investment program. In the energy sector, the independent transmission program will be launched later this year. A request for information for a multi-line transmission packaging will also be issued by the Independent Power Producer Office in July this year, followed by a request for proposal in November. This will enable the private sector to play a key role in the expansion of the transmission network. Madam Speaker, we have reconfigured the BFI, the budget for infrastructure facility, to run multiple bid windows instead of just one annual window. Earlier this week, we published a call for proposal under the new system. The first window is now open and will close mid-April. The next window will open soon thereafter. Financing decisions to determine the appropriate fiscal mechanism to support projects have also been separated from the evaluation and budget processes. This will facilitate the mobilization of significant private sector financing for proposals approved during the special window last year. Lastly, our efforts to diversify the financing structure to support infrastructure are taking shape. A credit guarantee vehicle to mobilize private sector capital by de-risking projects will be launched in 2026. Its initial focus will be on independent transmission, aimed at bridging the energy transmission deficit. Once the vehicle has demonstrated its efficacy, it will be broadened to include other sectors. Government will issue its first infrastructure bond in 25-26. We will also introduce other innovative financing instruments to diversify the infrastructure fund sources. Financial institutions, including pension funds, banks, development banks, and international financial institutions, have already expressed interest in participating. This, Madam Speaker, is how we plan to leverage infrastructure investment to ease supply-side constraints to the economy and improve access to social services the people get. Madam Speaker, there are several persistent spending pressures in health, education, transport, and security. These have to do with the government properly fulfilling its service delivery mandate. After careful consideration, the government has decided to fund these. Deferring the funding of these sectors further would compromise the government's ability to meet its constitutional obligation to those people. To raise the revenue needed, the government proposes to increase the VAT rate by 0.5 percentage point in 25-26 and by another 0.5 percentage point in the following year. This will bring the VAT rate to 16% by 26-27. Let me pause for a moment. Let me pause for a moment and say,
order, honorable members. Let's allow the minister to finish his presentation.
Madam Speaker, should the spending reviews and other measures we're embarking on yield enough extra revenue, we will reassess the need to embark on the second 0.5 percentage point increase to VAT. Government also proposes no inflationary adjustment to personal income tax brackets and medical tax credits. These measures will raise 28 billion in additional revenue in 25-26 and 14.5 billion in 26-27. Madam Speaker, this decision was not taken lightly. I can tell you now, no Minister of Finance is ever happy to increase taxes. We are aware of the fact that a lower overall burden of tax can help to increase investment and job creation and also unlock household spending power. We, however, have had to balance this knowledge against the very real and pressing service delivery needs that are vital to our developmental goals, and we cannot be further postponed. Honourable members, we thoroughly examined alternative raising the VAT rate. We weighed the policy trade-offs involved in increasing the corporate and personal income taxes. Increasing the corporate and personal income taxes would generate less revenue while potentially harming investment, job creation, and economic growth. Corporate tax collections have declined over the last few years, an indication of falling profits and a trading environment worsened by the logistic constraint and rising electricity cost. Furthermore, South Africa's corporate income tax collections are already higher than most of our peer countries. On the other hand, an increase to the personal income tax rate would reduce taxpayers' incentive to work and save. Our top personal income tax rate and our personal income tax collection as a percentage of GDP are far higher than those of the most developing countries. Increasing it is therefore not feasible. Taking on additional debt to meet the spending pressures was also not feasible. The amount is simply too large. The cost of borrowing would be unaffordable. Our sub-investment credit rating would also make this level of borrowing costlier and put us at a risk of even further downgrowth. Madam Speaker, VAT is a tax that affects everyone. By opting for a marginal increase to VAT, its distributional effect and impact were costly considered. The increase is also the most effective way to avoid further spending cuts and to enable us to extend the social wage. The government is very aware of the cost of living pressures faced by households, including higher food and fuel prices and rising electricity and transport costs. This is why we are taking concrete steps to protect vulnerable households. This is done through providing social grant increases that are above inflation, expanding the basket of zero-rated items to include vegetables, dairy liquid, blends, meats and poultry products. We are also not increasing the fuel levy for another year, saving consumers around 4 billion. Madam Speaker, broadening the tax base and improving the administrative efficiency of the South African Revenue Service allow us over time to spread the tax burden more evenly and equitably. With this in mind, SARS is allocated 3.5 billion in the current financial year and an additional 4.4 billion over the medium term. That takes the total SARS allocation to 7.5 billion over the medium term. By the end of February this year, SARS reported a significant increase in undisputed debt. This means billions of rand are owed to the state. The revenue collector has also detected 156,000 taxpayers who are not registered and who have not filed despite their substantial economic activity. We therefore call on all South Africans to comply with the law and support SARS in its endeavor to collect the revenue that enables government to fund and provide critical services. I also want to emphasize the importance of tax compliance. I thank all compliant taxpayers who pay their fair share of taxes. I also encourage those that are not compliant to do the right thing. The rewards of our tax compliance and efficiency take time. Once again, the investment we make today in SARS will allow us to collect at the time to make improvements. Madam Speaker, the revenue proposed through the tax measures announced in this budget will contribute largely to us providing 232.6 billion in additional funding to key programs over the medium term. This amounts to 102 billion in 25-26, 68 billion in 26-27, 62 billion in 27-28. The funding is for spending pressures for infrastructure investment, social protection, a higher than anticipated public service wage bill, a provisional allocation for critical frontline services. Honourable members, in the last year alone, public sector health system lost close to 9,000 health workers. We did not have enough money to retain or replace them, even after reprioritizing funds budgeted for consumables and medicine. Accruals in this sector, which is the money owed by department to vendors for service already provided, also ballooned to 22 million. Let me just dramatize this thing. How it works is that in a Department of Health in a province, they you provide services. The Department of Health does not have money to pay you now. They are going to wait for April. In April, they pay you with the new money for the previous year. The second year, in 25-26, they don't have money to pay for the new ones. So it can't be allowed to go on like that. It can't be allowed to go like that. Will be any responsible government if we allow such things to happen. And as a result, therefore, our health services are becoming dysfunctional. This means that the money allocated to departments ends up paying for previous year services and goods rather than for the current needs, setting off a vicious cycle of budget shortfalls, unpaid invoices, and a crisis in cash flow and the planning and the predictability of budgets. This is an untenable situation that we could not leave unresolved. As a result, consolidated spending, which exclude interest payment, increases from 2.4 trillion in 24-25 to 2.83 trillion in 27-28. Provinces will receive 2.4 trillion over the medium-term period. This budget includes allocation to support critical provincial functions related to health and education. We trust that the allocation will be used for their intended purposes. I must repeat, because these funds that are allocated to provinces go through what is a part of the equitable share, the decision to divide that money and allocate becomes a provincial one. And the provincial government is at liberty to use it in any manner it decides. And the final product is the loss of capacity in health services. The local government equitable share As the national are ready to take the lead to improve effectiveness and efficiency of spending, we will, together with the President, undertake an audit of ghost workers, starting within in national and provincial departments. Use the ongoing detailed review of labor market activity provision and public employment program to consolidate and rationalize to reduce duplications and improve operational efficiency across more than 100 active labor market programs in over 20 public institutions. The recommendation of this review will also be presented to Cabinet in due course. The entire public employment ecosystem. The aim of this review is Treasury will implement a significant changes to the budget process by reassessing the initial assumptions informing budget allocations with a view to creating room for improving spending. Madam Speaker, these reviews go beyond mere cost-cutting measures. They allow to systematically assess whether public expenditure is effectively aligned with the priorities of the government and whether it delivers the best possible value for money and impact for the people of South Africa while keeping us on the path of fiscal sustainability. These initiatives will give impetus to the slow implementation of the recommendation of the spending review. I call on ministers, MECs, DGs, HODs, and every official responsible for public funds to embrace these efforts and play their part. The proliferation of conditional grant has necessitated a review of the conditional grant system to reduce duplication and improve effectiveness of the programs. This project will implement the first phase of the recommendations of the review and include merging conditional grants in the basic education and agricultural sector. Preference-based conditional grants to metropolitan municipalities are also introduced, linked to institutional governance and financial reforms to improve services. Madam Speaker, the incentives in our current disaster management system are skewed towards relief and rehabilitation, when mitigation and readiness to minimize damage is the most cost-effective response. Our municipalities stand at the front line of disaster response, yet they are hamstrung by aging infrastructure, bureaucratic fragmentation, and limited access to emergency funds. The priority is to reduce the administrative burden to access emergency funds. Every hour of delay costs lives and livelihoods. Continuous improvements are made to the grant system to incentivize municipalities to access a variety of funding instruments for disasters. These include their own budget, the contingency reserve, conditional grant funding, and insurance. The budget allocates 1.7 billion to respond to future disaster over the medium term, while 4 billion is provisionally allocated to address backlogs recovery efforts for provinces and municipalities. The decline in municipality services is evident across cities. Towns and rural villages highlights the systematic challenges faced by this varying group of municipalities. As outlined by the President in his State of the Nation address, Phase 2 of Operation Vulindlela, the institutional structure of local government will be reviewed through the updating of the white paper of local government. In line with the Constitution, the principle of funds follow functions. The review of local government fiscal framework will examine how to appropriately finance local government relative to their functions and their form. Reforms to the revenue-generating service of local government, namely water and sanitation and electricity and refuse removal, are underway. So, the 8 metropolitan municipalities have met the minimum requirement for participation in the Financial Performance Incentive Grant, the Urban Development Financing Grant. Further allocations in the grant are dependent on municipalities meeting specific targets. related sets out in their performance improvement action plans. For 25-26, this includes critical institutional governance and management changes to creating an enabling environment for local term investment infrastructure. By ring-fencing the revenues from these services and running operating surpluses, these business units can generate I'm not saying these units can generate funds for infrastructure improvements to deliver quality services. Madam Speaker, in conclusion, allow me to reiterate that through the policy choices we have made and the carefully targeted allocations we are proposing, the public institutions should be in a better position to continue delivering much needed services. This budget reflects our collective efforts to chart a path through difficult times to prosperity. It represents a vision of future and realistic assessment of the present, as well as the options available to us right now. This vision can only be achieved by making difficult but considered policy choices, choices that weigh up trade-offs and commit to a way forward. Honourable members, this budget is the product of a combined and careful consideration of the Cabinet of the Government of National Unity. Despite some minor disagreements, I must confess, that has done the difficult and necessary work of assessing the alternatives open to us at the current conjuncture in our growth journey. Honourable members, this budget is also a proposal to you as Parliament that has been democratically elected to represent the aspirations and interests of South Africans by confronting the difficult choices needed to move our country forward. It is in this spirit that I draw to the words of the Pan-African leader Amal Kabar, who advises us, always bear in mind that the people are not fighting for ideas, but for things for things in anyone's mind. They are fighting to win material benefits, to live better and in peace, and to see their lives go forward to guarantee the future of their children. The policy choices proposed here are about achieving these material benefits. They are about moving South Africa and all South Africans forward into a better, more prosperous and equitable future. Speaker, as I close, allow me to express my deepest gratitude to the President and Deputy President for their counsel, their support, and for their leadership, in particular in this difficult budget. Thank you also to the Deputy Ministers of Finance and the excellent National Treasury team led by the Director General. Thank you to the Commissioner for the South African Revenue Services and the Governor of the South African Reserve Bank for their astute stewardship of these two key institutions. Thank you to my Cabinet colleagues, the Ministers' Committee in the Budget, and the Budget Council, who share the heavy load of the tough decisions that must make to maintain this sustainability of our public finances. To the Parliamentary Standing Committees of Finance, Appropriation and Public Account, I express my sincere appreciation. And of course, out of this threat, without the support of my wife and my family, it would not have been as easy as it would have been from Mom Chawe that I've been able to withstand. Who continue to entrust their aspiration to us. I thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Minister. Thank you. Can I allow members to take their seats? Honorable members, order. We have now heard the minister tabling the executive statement, which is a budget. It is tabled here in the House. Now the task is for you as Parliament to then reflect on this budget through the relevant committees. The papers tabled, order. Order, Honorable order. Thank you. Honorable members, order. Order. Honorable members, just ignore the people that are going out. Allow me to address you. You have now heard the budget tabled. Order. Honorable members, you will have your chance to address the media as you go out. But for now, just listen. The budget has been tabled. It is now going to be referred to relevant committees to interact with the budget, which allows you an opportunity as public representatives to engage with this executive statement. And it will then come back for debate in this very House, where you will express your views. For now, the House is adjourned, and we thank the Minister for the budget. I request members to stand. Order. I request members to stand and wait for the presiding officer and the maids to leave the chamber. That concludes the business of the meeting.
Following the President's State of the Nation address on 6 February, the Minister of Finance, Mr. Enoch Godongwana, will present the budget allocation for 2025 to Parliament. The budget speech, among others, aims to balance economic growth and support for the vulnerable in our society despite limited resources. During the speech, Mr. Godongwana will outline all the financial, economic and social commitments that the government will prioritize in its planned expenditure. The Minister will provide a detailed plan for 2025 spending, including proposals for revenue collection to help fund government's planned interventions and commitments. He will also introduce the Appropriation Bill and table the Division of Revenue Bill, which Parliament will process in the following months. The budget process is one of the critical instruments that Parliament utilizes to conduct oversight over the executive. Watch the budget speech live across Parliament's platforms. Your Parliament, your voice, your future.
And that marks the conclusion of the 2025 budget speech as delivered by the Minister of Finance, Mr. Enoch Godongwana, in the National Assembly at around 2 a.m. At 2 p.m. he started the speech. And these are some of the highlights that you as viewers might be interested in. Of course, it's important to note that for faster growth, of course, he said that they remain anchored on the following 4 pillars, and that is maintaining macroeconomic stability, implementing structural reforms and improving state capacity and accelerating infrastructure investment. Of course, to go onwards, we talk about VAT because that was the one issue that a lot of people had contentions and conflictions with. And of course, that is one of the reasons why we saw a postponement on the 19th of February 2025, when initially the minister was to take to the podium, and those proceedings were postponed as a result. And today, these are some of the increases and the proposals that he has made to the National Assembly. Of course, he says that to raise the revenue needed, that the government would propose an increase in VAT rate by 0.5 percentage point in the year 2025 to 2026 and by another 0.5 percentage point in the following year. Now, what does this mean? This means that VAT will be 16% in the financial year of 2026 to 2027. So this means that there will be a 1 percentage point increase by the year in the financial year of 2026 to 2027. Now, of course, government also proposes no inflationary adjustments to personal income tax brackets, rebates and medical tax credits, and that might come as a relief to some of you sitting at home. Of course, the minister then reasons out the reasons why they went for VAT instead of the other alternatives, and they say that they've examined alternatives to raising the VAT rate, and they've weighed up the policy trade-offs involved, including increases to corporate and personal income taxes. Now, increasing corporate or personal income taxes would generate a loss or would generate less revenue, and while potentially harming investment, job creation and economic growth. Of course, this talks to some of the conversations that we've had here on Parliament TV about balancing the needs in South Africa at the moment. Earlier in the week on Monday, we heard Mr. Musi Memani saying that we're in a position where the minister either there's no good or bad decision. It's either you make a worse or worser decision, and these are some of the trade-offs that the minister has proposed. Of course, he goes on to say that corporate tax collections have declined over the last few years, and that is an indication of falling profits and a trading environment that has worsened by the logistics constraints and rising electricity costs. Of course, he says that South Africa's corporate income tax collections are already higher than most of the peer countries. And of course, this then talks about investment, and that's a trade-off then that we see that the minister might have made to ensure that he increases VAT by 0.5% in the following financial years, and rather leave corporate tax to at the risk of not getting investments in South Africa. And of course, then he says, on the other hand, an increase to personal tax would reduce taxpayers' incentives to work and to save. Now, going on towards social security, these are some of the commitments that the minister proposed. Now, he says that social grants are allocated 284.7 billion rands in this financial year. And this means that the old age and disability grants will increase by 130 rand by April, bringing it to 2,315 rand. The child support grant will be increased by 30 rand, bringing it to 560 rand per month. And the foster care grant will be increased by 70 rand. Now, of course, you ask yourself, then what about the COVID-19 social relief of distress grant then? So in its current form, the minister explained that it will be extended by a year to the end of March 2026. And this means that 35.2 billion rands will be allocated for this purpose. To repeat that, the old age and disability grants will be increased by 130 rand in April. The child support grant will be increased by 30 rand this month. And that will amount to 560 rand, and the foster care grant will be increased by 70 rand. The COVID social relief of distress will remain the same, and it has been extended to the year 2026 in March. Now, when it comes to peace and security, and this has been a contentious issue, especially with the fallen soldiers of South Africa in the DRC earlier, he says that over the medium term, 5 billion rand will be allocated to the Department of Defense to support South Africa's participation in the Southern African Development Community, that's the SADC region, mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and to supplement existing peacekeeping activities. And of course, 9.4 billion rand has been allocated to fund the Defense Force and correctional services. Now, moving on to ensuring that government cushions households, especially within the cost of living pressures that we find ourselves in. The minister has said that the reason why they have taken such concrete steps to protect vulnerable households is to ensure that they cushion the cost of living pressures that you feel at home. And they have done this by providing social grant increases that are above inflation and expanding the basket of the VAT zero-rated food items to include canned vegetables, dairy liquid blends, and organ meats from sheep, poultry and other animals. And another thing that they have done is that they are not increasing the fuel levy for another year, saving consumers around 4 billion rand. Of course, another contentious issue was resourcing SARS and ensuring that the collection of revenue is done so in an efficient and effective way. And in this case, the minister has said that broadening the tax base and improving the administrative efficiency of South African revenue services allows them over time to spread the tax burden more evenly and equitably. And as a result, SARS has been allocated 3.5 billion rand in the current financial year and in an additional 4 billion rand over the medium term. Now, with that, of course, we've spoken about the Defence Force. We've spoken about the social grants that are very important to us. And right now, outside the dome, we are getting some reactions from members of Parliament. Stay tuned. You're watching Parliament TV.
Increase in petrol prices and electricity prices and the cost of living. On top of that, they are adding VAT increase, which clearly shows that they want to suffocate South Africans to an extent of not having anything to live by.
Of course, we've
Look,
spoken about
if they want to raise money, why do they not go after the irregular and wasteful expenditure, which is in excess of 126 million? Now, if you look at also the comparison between VAT, the amount that has been raised by VAT, as opposed to the amount that has been raised by the mining prices, the electricity prices, the country cost of living. On top of that, they are adding VAT increase, which clearly shows that they want to suffocate South Africans to an extent of not having anything to live by. If they want to raise money, why do they not go after the irregular and wasteful expenditure, which is in excess of 126 as the ATM now? If you look at also the comparison between VAT, the amount that has been raised by VAT,
There was a technical glitch outside of the dome, and Teminkosi was talking to the president of the ATM, Mr. Zungula. Of course, he was probably giving some insights on what he thinks about the budget speech that the minister has proposed in the National Assembly about a few minutes ago. Now, this is just a reminder of some of the highlights that the minister made in terms of his budget speech. And in terms of social security, the old age and disability grant will be increased by 130 rand, bringing it to 2,315 rand in April. The child support grant will be increased by 30 rand, bringing it to 560 rand per month, and the foster care grant by 70 rand. Now, in terms of the COVID-19 social relief of distress grant in its current form, it will be extended by a year to the end of March 2026. But unfortunately, in this regard, there is no increase currently. However, to ensure that this extension happens until March of 2026, the minister has proposed that 35.2 billion rand be allocated for that purpose. Now, to carry on with some of the highlights from the minister's speech, we look at early childhood development and basic education, which is important, especially looking at the fact that the Bella Act has now been enacted and will be implemented. Of course, the one issue with regards to budget cuts before was that there was an issue with teachers, the teacher-to-learner ratio in classes, and this meant that it would directly affect the quality of education that we had in our South African schools. And of course, the minister notes this and says, and has heard the cry from the basic education minister with regards to this, and the need to ensure that there is proper funding in schools, and that there's proper funding to ensure that there are enough teachers for the quality education that we so seek for the children of this country. Now, the minister does maintain that the learner-to-teacher ratios remain higher than they would like, and that means that they need more teachers in this classroom. He concedes and says that they are proposing an additional 19.1 billion rand. And that was Mr. Ntlamulo Ndlela from the MK party, obviously sharing some of his reactions and some of his insights on what the Minister of Finance, Mr. Enoch Godongwana, has proposed in terms of the budget speech. Of course, we have been highlighting some of the key elements of the speech that the Minister has outlined in the National Assembly. And with regards to health, the Minister has allocated 28.9 billion rand to the health budget, mainly to keep about 9,300 health workers in our hospitals and clinics. And of course, this goes in an atmosphere and a climate where we have been seeing that issues at the Helen Joseph Hospital, for example, where infrastructure is an issue, where there are workers shortages, there are doctor shortages and nurses. And this is something that is necessary with regards to funding to ensure that those problems are eradicated. And of course, it is not only in the Helen Joseph Hospital, and it is throughout the country where we see that there's an issue of infrastructure and staff shortages within the public sector. To go on, it will also be used to employ 800 post-community service doctors and to ensure that our pharmacies do not run out of medicines. Now, with regards to infrastructure, especially having touched on what is happening in the health sector and how it directly links to the infrastructure development, it ensures that he said that public infrastructure spending over the next 3 years will amount to more than 1 trillion rand. And the spending will focus on 3 sectors. 402 billion rand of transport and logistics will be allocated there, 219.2 billion rand for energy and infrastructure, and 156.3 billion rand for water and sanitation. Now, these are some of the commitments that the Minister has made. And of course, like the Speaker has said, that this process will be ongoing within Parliament throughout the committees that are there. These include the Portfolio Committee on the Standing Committee on Finance, the Standing Committee on Appropriations, and the committees within the NCOP. Just a reminder of what the Minister has proposed in terms of social security, especially having highlighted on the issues of poverty and inequality in our country with our interview that we had with Professor Julian May earlier on of the National Planning Commission. The old age and disability grants will increase by 130 rand. The child support grant will increase by 30 rand. The foster care grant will increase by 70 rand. And the COVID-19 social relief of distress grant will remain the same. These are the commitments to ensure that South Africans are cushioned, especially in the economic climate that we have. Now, of course, Thembinkosi is outside the dome and he is getting some reactions. And of course, there will be some conflicting reactions, especially because the reason why we find ourselves here is because of a postponement where we found that there were issues there. Thembinkosi has somebody there. Let's see what they have to say. Will remain the same. These are the commitments to ensure that South Africans are cushioned, especially in the economic climate that we have. Now, of course, Thembinkosi is outside the dome and he is getting some reactions. And of course, there will be some conflicting reactions, especially because the reason why we find ourselves here is because of a postponement.
Adjustment even on the 0.5% increase now. As long as we can get growth going, as long as we can have an increase in employment and therefore have a higher revenue base will be good, because with higher employment there will also be a reduction on the dependence on the SRD grant. So taken in its totality, this budget is workable, but Parliament still has the next 3 months to discuss the details of it and arrive at a vote of passing it or not passing it.
So ingaba izindaba zithetha ukuthini for abantu baseKhayelitsha, abantu abakuTsolo, abantu base-KZN, kwaNongoma, abantu abaseMpumalanga eSekhunda.
As long as we can get ithetha into enje, as long as we can ukubenzela amathuba omsebenzi, ukuze sikwazi ukwenzela amathuba omsebenzi. With higher employment there will also be a reduction on the dependence on the SRD. So taken in its totality, this budget is workable, but Parliament still has the next 3 months to discuss the details of it and arrive at a vote of passing it or not passing it. So ingaba izindaba zithetha ukuthini for abantu baseKhayelitsha, abantu abakuTsolo.
Yeah, okay. And of course, now that the budget speech has been tabled and proposals have been made, you're probably asking, what now? Well, just like the Speaker alluded earlier, the relevant parliamentary processes will take place. And of course, you can look forward to the Minister of Finance, Mr. Enoch Godongwana's appearance before a joint meeting with the Standing Committee on Appropriations, the Select Committee on Finance, the Standing Committee on Finance, and the Select Committee on Appropriations on Friday, the 14th of March 2025, where he will provide a detailed brief on the 2025 budget in venue S12A on the ground floor of the NCOP building at 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. And you can watch those proceedings right here on Parliament TV, DSTV channel 408. Now that's all that we have time for today, and it's been our pleasure to present to you this program on the national budget. From myself, Tepo Mori, and Tebinko Singoma, and the team behind the scenes, take care.
This book, our Constitution, protects our society and empowers us to govern. The Protea leaves are us, the people, who freely elect our voices in Parliament. The drum calls the people of Parliament, through whom we govern together. And the sun is our country, healing our past, improving our lives, and energizing our potential. Together, our Constitution, our people, our Parliament, and our country are building our great South African nation. Parliament TV, channel 408 on DSTV.